All right, welcome to the Grandman Podcast. I'm your host, Harley Fox, and today we've got a special guest from the Australian Army, Joe Cazey. Joe is an engineer in the Army and a veteran of the Vietnam War, so excited to talk to him today. Thanks for being here, Joe.
My pleasure.
Cool. So, what have you been up to today? Speaking of mates and mates and stuff. And
I started this morning with yoga at 6:30, followed by breakfast, pancake breakfast at 8 o'clock, followed by a bike ride at 9 o'clock, followed by coming to you.
Nice. Is there a big crew that does that?
Well, different numbers. Yeah, we only had a half a dozen at yoga, probably about 15 or 20 at breakfast, and about 14 on the bike ride, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, everyone's got their own bikes now. I had my mates go over there.
No. They're still using it. They had to reverse that decision.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. The public pressure. There was a lot of complaints.
Okay.
And, I don't know what was prompting the original or the suggested change, but it didn't get off the ground.
Oh, okay. That's good.
So, but most of us do have our own bikes anyway. But I think the main ones who use them, a couple of guys use the electric bikes, and then 2 or 3 staff members use the other bikes, and a lot of them still sit in the shed. Yeah.
So you got that the old faithfuls, the crew that still cruise along to mates and mates all the time.
There are some new faces amongst them, newer faces. Some people who, in fact, I would think that probably this morning there would have only been 3 or 4 of the group that if I used their names, you would know them. And the rest would be strangers to you, I would think. Yeah,
right. Yeah. Well, that's good. You guys are still cracking on. And
I get a lot out of it, and it's very convenient. I just live locally, so it's not quite as locally as you, but I'm not much further. It's a comfortable bike ride if I choose to ride from home. But I don't. I'll just put it on the frame on the back of the car, and I'm down there in a couple of minutes and ready to go.
Good stuff. All right, so digging into your life a little bit.
Sure.
Where'd you grow up?
Born in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, South Coogee, Maroubra area, and so I was a beachside boy. We used to swim 10 months in the year. Nobody swam in winter, June and July, but the 1st of August it was open slather. And that was my first several years. My dad died when I was quite young. He had tuberculosis, and after a few years, Mum married again. We moved out to the western suburbs of Sydney, Ashfield, and I went to school for my final years in that part of the world, both at Ashfield and in Leichhardt in Sydney.
A surfer dude?
Well, I was a surfer for the first several years, but once we moved out to Ashfield, it was a bit further to get to, and I was doing less and less as time went on. So I used to ride bikes, played a lot of football, and not highly competitive, but club football and school football was the.
What's your football, NRL?
Well, this
rugby
was
league?
Rugby league at school, and the Sydney competitions in those days, the only people who did rugby pretty much were the GPS schools, and I was going to state schools for most of my high school years. And,
it's funny how the differentiate the
I
public schools
I really didn't. I didn't notice it at the time. I wasn't even conscious of it. It's only afterwards I put it together and thought, because when I joined the Army, they played rugby union, and there was very little league in the Army in those days. It was still played occasionally, but most of the competitions were AFL or rugby or soccer, hockey, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all the. Good thing was I was a hooker in league and I was a hooker in union, so it didn't matter. I was pretty comfortable switching over.
Same.
In those days, the hooker used to actually have to win the ball, instead of it being put under your feet like it is nowadays. It was a fight, and
in league,
in league and union.
Has union moved to the same sort of just pushing through?
I think they had a lot of injuries from the. But they still push and shove like crazy, and there's the occasional fist that flies around, I'm sure.
Little uppercuts in the scrum.
The position of hooker, you had your arms completely occupied, so I could never punch anyone even though I wanted to. I'd have fallen into the middle and been trampled to death if I'd tried that. But so it was my props and second rowers who did all of the less than legal stuff if it was going to happen.
Push and shove. Yeah, nice. So you're pretty sporty growing up?
I was sporty growing up, but it wasn't so much that I was any good at it. I was an aspirant rather than an achiever. And most of the time, I was, well, I'll give you an example. When I went to Duntroon, they had 8 rugby teams and I was the 9th best hooker. So I didn't get so many games. So I took up hockey when I was in the first year in the military.
Oh, yeah. And old field hockey.
Yeah, and then when I went to Portsea, that was very sport-oriented. In fact, the commandant at the time used to select you by the sports that you played.
Oh,
and if you didn't play a sport, he'd find a sport for you and he'd train you for it. He taught people to pole vault. This is a colonel.
Right.
He was sport crazy. And half the selection board process was discussing your sporting prowess. And, I guess he associated that with leadership. But, the fact of life was that he was out to win. We beat Duntroon and Cresswell and Point Cook every year. We were mad keen sport players. And, and a bit of military chucked in too. But he saw it as sport and military being
just look at your size and shape and what can I shape you into the best of and win?
Yeah. Well, I remember him, it was very un-PC in those days, but I remember him saying to the guy from Papua New Guinea in our class, he said, so you're a black guy, you should be able to throw a spear. And this guy said to him, no, I've never had to. He said, well, how about a javelin? No, I've never done that. Would you like to learn? Yeah, well, I'd like to learn, anything to get in. And he won the bloody inter-service javelin competition.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
There you go.
Old Stan taught him how to throw a spear. Totally un-PC. You'd never do it today.
Yeah. Well, maybe you would, but not so vocally.
Yeah.
Cool. So you went to school around that area and then...
Yeah, I went a variety of schools because, changes that occurred both as a result of when Mum married again, we moved and that caused a few school changes. But
how old were you when your dad passed?
I was 10 and he contracted TB in the 30s, wasn't diagnosed till 1947 when I was 2 years old and it took him 8 years to die. And,
right.
In those days, they had sanatoriums scattered around outside cities where people with those sorts of infectious diseases, and TB was very infectious and was very prevalent then. 5 years after he died, it had virtually been stamped out because of antibiotics.
Yeah, right.
And they eventually got on top of it, and those hospitals were all repurposed, But it was sad. We didn't have as much to do. I'd visit him we used to visit him in hospital. He was in Waterfall, south of Sydney, south of Cronulla. Sutherland. And, it was a big journey every Sunday if you went. Mum went every Sunday, but sometimes my older brother would go, sometimes my sister and I would go, sometimes one of us would go. And I always enjoyed visiting him in hospital. Sometimes he was really up and about and could walk around the grounds. Other times, he wasn't up to it, so we'd go down and entertain ourselves while Mum and he talked.
Was you a pretty close-knit family by the sound of it?
Yeah, well, close-knit then. And, it was he was allowed out. I mean, that sounds like he's in prison. But, when he was well, he could come home for short periods during school holidays and things. But, we had to be very careful. We were constantly being checked. And we all had TB as a result. We all caught it. But we were treated and it was far easier to treat when it was early days.
Yeah, okay.
And his was some 12 years into it by the time it was diagnosed, so he went down the gurgler.
No, good. And how long afterwards did your stepdad come into the picture? 3
years or more. Yeah, sorry. Well, I was 10, and Mum married when I was 13, yeah. No, stepdad married when I was 13.
Did you end up pretty close to him?
Yeah, actually I did. And, he was a builder in Sydney and he sort of was a bit of a head sherang in the Master Builders Association, and he helped set up the chair of building science at the University of New South Wales, and he was determined I was going to be one of the first folk through that. And but in 1962, which was my last year at school, there was a thing called a credit squeeze, which was a depression by any other name, but short term. but nobody wanted to use the word depression because there were too many folk around who lived through the Great Depression in the 30s, and they didn't want to cause panic, so they gave it a flash name, credit squeeze. But it kicked the crutch out of the building industry and others. And so I thought, geez, who wants to go into an industry that can be reduced to nothing with the stroke of a pen?
Yeah.
So I scurried into the army to learn engineering, and I thought I'd come in through the back door after it had recovered. But it never quite happened. And so I went into the military at 17.
Were you a Nasho or
No. This is regular. This is before national service had come in. This is all regular.
Yeah.
And the commissioning system in those days was set up purely and simply for regulars, and you could join as a soldier for 3 years or 6 years. I think it was. I could have that wrong, but something like that. But officers, we actually had to sign a thing shortly after we got there into the college that our resignation, if tendered, may not necessarily be accepted, that we were in at the Queen's pleasure. So in other words, our commission, if it was granted, if we earned a commission, we couldn't just resign the following day. We had to serve on to pay back the service, pay back the training and the money they'd spent on developing us. And so, I had no problems with that. I figured I've got a career. This sounds good. At that stage, there was a lot of...
What's the, they call it ROSO these days, the return of service obligation?
I have no idea. I just know that there was a fairly famous case going on just before I got in, probably 61, 62, where a very intelligent but not necessarily very decent person had graduated from Duntroon, gone through the university to get the full degree and everything in engineering, and he got the Queen's Medal and all the top prizes, and he did well at the university. And then he decided, stuff this, I'm not going to be a soldier, I'm going to get out and make a fortune in the industry. And it was quite celebrated because he used to go AWOL, then he'd be court-martialed for being AWOL, and it was making the papers, and that's what caused them to make us sign that document, that we had no illusions that we could just get trained and then bugger off. And so... I was expecting to, have a career out of it, so it didn't occur to me to count the years. I just didn't quite know. And at that stage, we'd started a bit of a problem with Indonesia called confrontation, and it was all to do with Indonesia wanting to disband Malaysia, which had been set up just prior to, while I was still at school. And they didn't, Indonesia didn't like the idea that Malaya had joined up with Sarawak and Sabah, and originally Brunei as well, and Singapore, to create this thing called Malaysia. Now, as it turned out, Brunei and Singapore eventually pulled out of it quite soon, but it still meant that there was a Malaysian presence on the island of Borneo, or Kalimantan as the Indons called it, and there was a bit of grief. So because we were in a 5-power agreement with Malaysia and Singapore over defence, Australians were involved in fighting in Borneo against the Indons, and Army engineers were building roads and stuff in Sabah and Sarawak to develop the place to make it sort of a bit more convenient to get around. And so once I was commissioned, I figured I'd be off to Indonesia pretty soon, or Borneo. And so I started learning Indonesian and things like that as part-time exercise. I've never set foot in Indonesia to this day. I've learnt the language about 4 times along the way. Learned it the first time and finished up in Vietnam. Learned it the second time, finished up in New Guinea. Learned it the third time, finished up in Singapore. Learned the 4th time and I finished up in Lebanon, the Middle East. I've never set foot in even Bali.
Yeah, I haven't even gone to visit.
Never used it.
Could have gone over there and hung out with the locals.
Yeah. And it's the only way I would have been able to develop the language. That's why I had to keep going back and learning it again. So one day it'll come in handy.
You speak any of it now?
No, enough to get into trouble, not enough to get out.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I spoke French when I was at uni, but
if you don't use
pleasantries, but
if you
everything
don't
else
use it, you lose it. But and that's what I mean. If I was serious about learning, I'd go and plonk myself in a kampong somewhere in a Bahasa-speaking population, and I'd pick it up pretty quickly. I think more quickly than I will from a classroom here in Australia. Yeah, immersion. Yeah.
Cool. So you joined is it still called ADFA back then?
No. It was before ADFA was established. So each service had its own college, and some of them had a secondary arrangement now. So Army had Duntroon, which had been going since 1911, and early in the Korean conflict in the early 1950s, they realised that the throughput at Duntroon wasn't sufficient to sustain a war. And so they reverted to things that they had been doing during World War II, and that's training people in other locations. So they created Portsea, which was a quarantine station near the headland of Port Phillip Bay. Mm-hmm. And it became a 12-month course, and officer graduates would be second lieutenants or sub-lieutenants in the Navy, and the Duntroon graduate would come out after 4 years as a full lieutenant. And so it was timed in such a way that if two people who started on the same day, one at Portsea, one at Duntroon, graduation 4 years later for the Duntroon person would be 1 day ahead of the third anniversary of a Portsea graduate. So they would always be 1 day senior to you. And that was fine. You know, they'd had a lot more money spent on them. So we were commissioned, and we could not become full lieutenants until 4 years after we'd been commissioned. We had to do, 3 years. We had to do 3 full years as a second lieutenant.
Okay, so you did the 1 year option.
Yeah. And so the guys I started with in January of 1963, they graduated in December of 66, by which time I was already on active service. And I'd done my time.
How'd you get the engineering degree?
No, I didn't get a degree. The Corps of Royal Australian Engineers could not employ adequately all officers being qualified engineers. If that was the case, they'd be board shootless because it's just not enough technical work around. There's an awful lot of other things that happen in the Corps that don't require a civil qualification.
Gotcha.
So what was, it was intended that you could apply for and get civil schooling and complete that with an additional return of service obligation.
Yeah.
But at that stage, as I said, Borneo was on the horizon and followed quickly by Vietnam. I was a tad busy to think about going to uni. And as a young, bulletproofed 19, 20-year-old, and I was commissioned at 19, I was just a bloody kid, really.
Yeah.
You figure you spend all this time training to do this stuff, you better go and do it. And so I had no qualms about going to Borneo, but as it turned out, I was posted to a unit that was born out to go to Vietnam. We left in May of 1966.
So that was your first deployment?
Yeah, and I had, aside from after I graduated and was commissioned, then you went to your individual corps school and you undertook training, and it varied from different branches of infantry, armoured, cavalry, the artillery, engineers, ordnance, whatever.
Yeah. And
you did your course there. In our case, it was an 8-month course. Mm-hmm. And at the finish of that was just the start of national service. So there was all this pile of, treble or quadruple the number of people going through SME, and they needed additional subunits as offering training. So I was posted to one field squadron, but attached back to the school as a troop commander of some of these trainees. And at that stage, one field squadron had just come back from their turn in Borneo, so they were in reorganisation phase. They really didn't need a second lieutenant at that stage, whereas the school did.
Yeah.
So I did 2 courses of about 3 months, running as a platoon commander, troop commander, we called it, with trainees, and then it was announced that one field squadron would deploy to Vietnam in mid-66, and so my detachment was revoked and I went back to the unit, which was great, and I completed. They'd done a lot of training in the meantime, and which I missed out on, and so I was slotted in. I was the most junior officer in the squadron, I was sort of like a fifth wheel and make him admin officer. Yeah, okay. And I had squat training in admin. I knew so little it's embarrassing. But suddenly I was the admin officer, the adjutant of the unit. Oh, yeah, right. And thank God for good NCOs, a good chief clerk and a good quartermaster sergeant and a good transport bloke and a good plant operator sergeant and all that sort of jazz, cook sergeant. I had 5 sergeants working for me and I knew nothing about what they did. I was learning from the ground floor up.
Oh, mate, nothing's changed. No. Subbies don't, subbies are still kids these days.
Yeah, and one of the things that they told us when we were undergoing our training, you are expected to make mistakes. So don't shy away from doing stuff for fear you'll make mistakes. Because if we see you're not making mistakes, we'll figure you're not doing anything. So, it was a case of jump in the deep end and swim like crazy.
Yeah.
And as I said, I had good NCOs. They were some of them were a bit like Sergeant Bilko. They were into scam you a bit if they could. But generally speaking, they were reliable. Yeah. And, and the thing was that, years later when I talked to junior officers who'd just been commissioned, I said, look, rely on your NCOs. On the whole, they are really good. There's some that are a bit mediocre, but you'll find that most of them are very, very reliable.
Yeah,
and you will learn so much if you just shut your bloody mouth and open your ears and learn from them rather than, don't let them take over, but, ask their advice. Talk with them and the corporals and things like that. Don't just rely on, the manual says to do it this way. Well, usually that doesn't work. It was meant for, the
guidance.
Guidance of fools, yeah. And as I said, I had good NCOs. I was heavily reliant upon them and they did the right thing by me at every turn. And, I might have been only a kid because some of them probably had kids older than I was. Possibly. And, it was just one of those things you accept that, I'm here to learn and, start learning. Start learning, yeah.
Best mentality to have going in for sure. You don't want to go in there thinking you know everything.
Yeah. So
20-year veterans.
We headed off on HMAS Sydney on the 24th of May 1966 and we arrived on the 6th of the 6th, 66. What a day. Easy to remember.
Easy to remember.
Damn easy to remember.
So how long had you been in by this stage?
Well, I'd been commissioned since December 64, so it was 18 months. Yeah. And,
so what's, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that, the learning curve had been fairly steep. We were just getting the squadron ready to get on the ship and I was supposed to go on the advance party, which left in March or something, April. Yeah. And that was the original plan. But then in those days, officers had to ask their commanding officer for permission to get married. And I'd been engaged to be married later that year. And so, I fronted up to the boss and did the right thing, asked for permission. He said, when are you planning to do it? And I said, Easter Monday, which is the 11th of May. And, 11th of April, I think it was. And he said, that's only 2 days before you're due to fly out. I said, yeah, that's okay. And he said, no. He said, get married by all means, but I'll take you off the advance party and put you on the main body to come up on the ship.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Which was good, except that, you've got to go and find accommodation for 6 weeks now. Up in Atlanta, I could have just used the back of the van. And anyway, we duly got married and on fairly short notice because, it was all planned to be 6 months, 8 months down the track. And then, as I said, we got married, got more training done in that intervening period, loaded the ship, HMAS Sydney. It wasn't its first run as a Bong Tau ferry. It was probably second or third run. And that was good because you get to know your blokes a whole lot better, in the close confines of a ship.
You sailed all the way from Sydney up to Vietnam. Yeah, well, how long did that take? 10
to 12 days. Oh, well, hang on. 24 through to, the 6th, 10 days. Yeah, 10, 12 days. And he did the usual crossing the line business. It was more than half none of the soldiers very few of the soldiers had travelled overseas before, so just about everyone in there, and there were still some sailors.
What'd you cop?
Oh, mate, they really hit the officers hard. We had a thing, an army thing. It was a water tank made of canvas with a kapok ring around the top that floated, and so it folded down flat when it was dry and put away. And they had these things, and several of them set up, full up of seawater, and then all the slops from the bloody wardroom and all the slops from the bloody cookhouse and stuff. And I think a bit of bloody engine oil or whatever. It was just a seething mass of crap. And, we had to go through that.
Got a dunk?
Well, it was more than a dunk. It was several things you had to do, bobbing for apples and that shit, and you had to keep going till you got an apple. And they were greasy and they were slimy. And you thought, if I don't die before I get there, I'll survive. But yeah, it was. Looking back, it was fun. And it was done in. Nobody got hurt unless they did something stupid. There was a few people who were smart asses that decided they'd fight the system. And
were you having a laugh, or were you?
Well, I had a laugh because I figured that I was only a short ass. I was no point trying to take on these matlows who were running it, the whole system was designed. I'd read about it, I knew about it beforehand. It wasn't like as if it was what's going on, but there probably were some people who weren't aware of what was going on. But
junior sailors,
and anyway, anyone who was a smart ass and gave the matlows who were running it stick, then they got stick back. I just figured go with the flow. And anyway,
were you on a navy transport? What ship were you on?
I was on Sydney, HMAS Sydney. And
I thought you said you got on Sydney. Sydney.
Yeah, we did. Actually, I got a photo of me standing beside my mum and dad, and honestly, I looked like a 12-year-old, and wearing a school cadet uniform. But no, we sailed out of Sydney on the 24th, as I said, and
on HMAS Sydney.
Yeah, ironically, it was the same day that the first national serviceman was killed in Vietnam.
Yeah, right.
And they announced it in the papers, and so in those days the paper boys used to be all around the street corners, paper, read all about it. Yeah, first Nasho killed in Vietnam. And of course we got a great bunch of Nashos on the ship with us, and they're all going, not happy, Jan. And
do you remember the date that Australia first got involved?
In Vietnam? Well, it was back before I joined, because it was 1962. We started sending advisors to Vietnam in 1962. And, I think it was only 100 or something like that at that stage. And that was the first several years. And then in June of 65, we sent 1st Battalion, 1 Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment over and added some, armoured personnel carriers, engineers and guns and things to it. So they were already there and operating as part of 173rd Airborne Brigade at Ben Hoa.
So they'd been there for
8 months, so 8 or 9 months by the time we got there.
Yeah. And
so there was sort of a bit of an overlap. 1 RAR came home, 5 RAR took over, and that's where Private Nowak was in 5 RAR. And in Operation Hardyhood, which was the occupation of the area around Neweydat, which we were going to occupy, was the site where he was killed. And it was unfortunately, it finished up being a friendly fire situation. I don't know all the details, but I know it was covered up at the time. It wasn't mentioned as friendly fire at that time, but it became so evident later.
It's too much of that, eh?
Yeah, he, I don't know whether he was in the wrong or someone else was in the wrong. I'm not passing judgment. I'm just saying that it happened. It was going to happen eventually. Someone was going to get killed. And but most of us at that age, you just it sounds cliche, but you feel you're bulletproof. It won't happen to me. It'll happen to someone else. And and that was very much my philosophy for the 12 months. My new wife and my parents had a very different philosophy. They were seeing me off, never to see me again, kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
And I understand that, but in your own head, part of your survival instinct is, I'm 20 years old and I'm bulletproof.
Can't be killed.
It won't happen to me.
Yeah.
Someone else might get done, but it won't be me.
That probably helps to get you through it, huh?
Oh, it does. But getting married before I went, I think was a smart move. If I'd have we delayed the wedding by 6 months and said, I'll get married when I come home, I probably would have been more of a peanut brain than I was, knowing that I already had a wife at home. And I think that helped me to make judgments that were safer than stupid.
Yeah. Try to get home safe.
Well, she was a prolific letter writer. She wrote about 380 letters to me in 365 days.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't get them all, and they didn't arrive in sequence. But she used to number them. Instead of just relying on the date, she'd put a number on the envelope. So if you got 3 or 4 envelopes at the one time, there might be 2 or 3 gaps between the numbers, but you knew what sequence to read them in. So you didn't sort of, hang on, haven't I heard this before? I didn't write anywhere near that amount. I probably, flat out writing one every second day or third day, and sometimes there are only a couple of lines. But there was a big problem with the unions at home, including the Postal Workers Union, who were opposed to Vietnam, and so were the dockers. So there was a problem getting resupply because of that. There was a problem getting mail. So one of the slogans that some guys had tattoos done was "Go home and punch a postie."
Did they?
Well, I have no idea. I've got no tattoos. So
if you got the tattoo, you kind of have to. Do you think it helped getting all those letters?
Oh, it did immensely, even though they arrived out of sequence. And like I say, the numbers it wasn't always complete. There were some that just disappeared in the system. Whether that was the unions, whether that was our own postal system, I've got no idea. But just getting a letter, whenever you're out in ops and you came back in, and there'd be 3 or 4, anything up to 10 sometimes letters waiting for you, man, that changes your life completely.
Yeah.
It,
would have been a different story if you were just there by yourself with none of that.
Yeah. I mean, there were guys there who had and there were a lot of Dear Johns, and those people suffered dreadfully. I mean, there's nothing you can imagine your missus or your girlfriend or whatever writes and says, "I'm sorry, Fred, I'm not going to be here when you get back." I've got,
It's funny you say Fred. That's my granddad's name that was up more.
Oh, okay. Well, it's just a random name. But the thing was,
common.
Those guys sometimes did really silly things straight up. I mean, aside from getting pissed, which was understandable, but when they were out in ops, sometimes they were a bit dangerous because they either distracted or just lost the will. And you had to really look after them to make sure that, we weren't collateral damage by virtue of them being careless, because either they weren't thinking or they were thinking of other things, or they were just thinking, why bother going home?
Did your mail get censored or pre-read or anything?
Not that I'm aware of. I never was asked to censor anyone.
Wasn't open when you got it?
No, the incoming mail wouldn't be censored. That wouldn't be a problem. It's outgoing mail that would be, in previous wars, outgoing mail was censored because going from operational area home, so that information wasn't inadvertently passed about where am I and things like that. They knew where we were. It was on the news every night. You're in Newidad or you're operating in Phuoc Tuy province and things like that. There was no locational secrecy. Ironically, funny things going up on the ship. I remember we were passing through islands, which I now assume are part of the Philippines, and I asked this petty officer on the deck one day, I said, what islands are they? And he said, I can't tell you. What do you mean you can't tell us? Oh, in case you get lost off the ship, and they'll then know what the route was that the ship passed through. And I thought, yeah, right. I can just see that happening.
It's almost like you'd want to keep the censor the incoming mail to keep the Dear Johns for the boat ride home, because
maybe there just wasn't the people to do it. We were as busy as one-armed paper hangers. There was engineers, and I'm not saying we were worse off than others, but we've always got work, whether we were back in base or out in the field. You had stuff on, even things that you weren't initially trained for, already expecting to do. The amount of unexploded ordnance. We'd be, operating with a battalion or a cab unit or something like that, and you'd come across stuff lying on the ground. You couldn't leave it there because Charlie would pick it up and use it against you. So you had to get rid of it. You had to blow it. So none of us originally had EOD, explosive ordnance disposal training. We sure as hell learned on the spot because they had little dinky books that the Americans produced and passed around to us, and oddly enough, naval gunfire, we were close to the coast, and naval gunfire support was reasonably available. But those shells were designed to hit a hard thing called a ship, mostly. And so the rounds were not optimised towards softer ground like marshes and sand hills and things like that. And so it skipped across the ground, boink, 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 went out of puff, and it just lay there.
Oh, okay.
So you got a 5.5-inch gun or a round of a 4.5 or whatever it happens to be lying there on the deck. So Charlie thinks, hang on, I can turn that into a mine, or I can cut that open and get the explosive out of it and use it in some way. So we had to demolish it. I remember on one op along the coast, I think I stopped counting at 77 naval gunfire rounds.
Oh, wow.
And that was in the space of probably less than that number, 6 days, 5 days or 6 days.
Did the word get back to stop trying to...
No. We needed naval. I mean, that just shows you how much fire was coming in. Because
so
not everything...
77 of thousands and thousands.
Yeah, most of it went off and did the job it was supposed to do. But, and to say, I believe the planning figure is that 10% of all ordnance will not function as planned, whether it's bombs, guns, rounds, anything, malfunctioning in one form or another. And that's with all the quality control that was probably available to produce that particular weapon or projectile. So even aerial bombs, you go into an area that had been heavily bombed and there'd be one or two 500-pounders just lying there. It didn't go off. And no reason why it's ever been thus. And blow them up. We carried shitloads of explosive.
Just put some C4 on the side of it or something?
Yes. Well, like I said, we had these little American-produced, they were so cheap, Charlie, these books, that they were just line drawings. They weren't coloured illustrations or anything like that, weren't even photos. And it showed you everything from a hand grenade. And a lot of it was enemy stuff, the enemy World War II, they called them potato masher grenades. They had a little bamboo stem made in communist China. And there were a lot of those because the way they were set off, there was a bamboo handle and a little cap, and they pulled the cap off and there was a bit of string. They pulled a string and it was like a match-type ignition, right? And if it didn't function, they'd throw it because they didn't know that it hadn't functioned, and it would go off, but occasionally they would fail to go off too. So they were, fairly, I won't say common, but we certainly learned quickly how to dispose of them. And, you never knew with unexploded ordnance what was dangerous if you touched. So you moved nothing, absolutely nothing. Blew it in situ, minimum contact, and just get rid of the damn thing. But, of course, you couldn't do it while there were troops around. You had to do it as... So, for example, I'm moving with battalion headquarters and my blokes were out with the companies and platoons, and they'd report all this stuff. We'd mark it all down. We'd work out a plan. When the battalion picked up and moved next morning, we'd stay behind and blow up all this crap, and an APC would pick us up and catch up with the mob. Yep. And so you're out by yourself and you just thought, hope no one's looking. But
this is behind the line that's progressed forward.
We've moved forward, yeah. I mean, there were people talk about lines, but there weren't lines in Vietnam. You were wherever you were all round defence yourself. Yeah, right. Whether you were one person, a section, a platoon, a troop, a battalion, whatever, you were gazing out in 360 degrees because you were the line as such. It wasn't like World War I or II where the line moved forward and it was very
battalion progresses.
And so it made for problems, particularly in regard to air support, because in traditional air support of ground troops, there's what's called a bomb line, and behind that, nothing that's dropped. In front of that, everything is fair game. So where were the blokes on the ground? And, of course, we weren't walking around with big coloured panels or anything like that to show the jet jockeys up top where we were. You would occasionally throw smoke if you wanted to make sure that, they didn't zap. If they were coming reasonably close to you, so you'd throw smoke, and then whether it was a helicopter or a jet or something, you'd have a radio exchange and they'd say, throw smoke. And you'd go back, thrown smoke, and you didn't say the colour. And then they'd say, I see green, I see orange, I see yellow, I see purple. And you say, copy that. And that was our one we throw. Because Charlie had coloured smoke grenades too. So he would think, there's jets about, gunships about, I'll chuck a smoke and they won't know. So if we said we're throwing smoke and they're listening to us on the radio, they could throw smoke at the same time. Oh, there's a yellow one, but we just threw a purple one. Go with the purple, thanks.
You want to hope they don't have all the same colours.
Well, you hope they're not colourblind.
That's why I could never be a pilot.
Yeah, well, I'm colourblind to some extent too, but I'm what we called in those days CP3 safe, which meant that red and green together give me problems. But I know you've got a bigger problem, or you're more profound than I am on that. But it didn't stop me doing anything. The only job it stopped me doing in the army was being a painter. And I never wanted to be a painter anyway. I hate painting.
Painting what?
Painter and decorator. Like a trade, a painter and decorator. In engineers, we had them.
Oh, wow.
But I couldn't be one of those, but that was good because I didn't want to be anyway. That was the only trade I was allowed to use explosives, even though all the fuses and stuff were colour-coded because they were obvious. I mean, they didn't clash. We had nothing that was red on green or green on red.
Okay.
And that was where
So you can see red or green if they're by themselves, you can tell the difference.
I can see them usually together, but where I became aware of it, when I was a kid, South Sydney Football Club used to have red and green stripes. They were 1 1/8 inches apart. I remember measuring them at some stage. And out on Sydney Cricket Ground, when they were playing Western Suburbs or whatever, at some distance away, their striped thing merged into brown. And it just looked the same colour to me as if they had no stripes at all. The reds and greens blended together and the combined colour was brown. I thought everyone saw it that way. And I didn't realise that, I had a problem until I went into the army and they were testing me and they said, the Ishihara test, I think they call it, was a book with different dots, patterns in it. What number's on that page? I said, there's no number there. That's the trick page. He said, there's no trick page. There's a number on every page. No, there's none on that. Sorry, there is. It turned out to be 22, I remember. I couldn't see 22 on this thing as long as my bum pointed to the ground. And anyway, they then revert to a thing called it was a candle test or something they called it. It was a thing that looked like a...
Flashing lights?
No, this was this is probably... In your day, it was probably a lot more modern, but in our day, it was a thing that looked like an old-fashioned alarm clock and with just a black cylindrical thing, like about the same shape as a traditional alarm clock, tiny wee hole in it. And they would turn a disc, and if you could see the colour and identify the colour, so when they turned this, that's yellow, that's red, that's green, that's blue. There's no colour coming through. That one's white, that one's pink. That one, that made you safe. In other words, you could identify the colour in isolation. Okay. It was where it was merging that was a problem. And so for certain trades, that would be an issue. But, I was CP3 safe, so I was allowed to do those things.
Cool. Yeah, you do the Ishihara and then you follow it up with like a flashing box test. It's just like a little dot in a big black box. Yeah, well,
that's just a more modern version, I guess, of the one that...
it's only got 3 colours now, though. It's white, red and green.
Oh, okay.
And then so they flash 2 colours up at the same time and you say the top one first and then the bottom one. So you're like white, red, red, green, red.
Okay. Yeah.
They stopped me halfway through and they're like, you got to say the top one first, right?
Yeah, well, this one was... I reckon I could build one, with my technology limitations, I could build what we were using in the 60s because it was just simply a circular enclosed thing, and the only reason it was circular was so that you could rotate the disc that had the little coloured panels on it.
Yeah. But, cool. So you're on the ship. Spirits are pretty good because you thought you were 10 foot tall and bulletproof.
I was a whole lot less than 10 foot, but I was bulletproof, yeah.
You got over there and...
We were fairly fit because there was still space around the flight deck for us to run. So we're doing a fair bit of running, and there'd be, programmed, because there were too many troops for this space available to exercise simultaneously. So there'd be PDIs working, groups, subunits, whatever. So you'd be doing so much PT a day, some shooting over the back. They'd chuck floating objects off the ship and you let fly with 7.62 SLR rifles. No point firing the smaller ones. I had an Owen, which World War II weapon, Owen machine carbine, 9mm, great in the jungle, lousy out in the open ground in Vietnam, I can tell you. You have to aim up at 45 degrees and allow for wind to try and hope to hit the target. So they replaced those after the Battle of Long Tan. That was their demise. Was seen to be too low velocity and too low range to be any effective when they were replaced with M16s.
What was it called?
The Owen machine carbine. It was quite famous. Australian developed 9mm 30-round magazine. Excellent because it could operate no matter how much mud it was put in. The testing, they used to chuck the Thompson machine gun, a Sten and an Owen into this muddy patch and pull them out and see whether they'd fire. And the Owen was the only one that could fire in those conditions.
Yeah, right.
The Sten would block up, the Thompson would block up. And the Thompson was 10 times more expensive. They were making them quite quickly in Lithgow Small Arms Factory in Australia, and the Americans quite liked them too because they were so reliable. They developed a thing later which they called the grease gun, and because it looked like a mechanical grease gun, and it was, I think, a 45 caliber weapon of very similar playback design.
So you carried the Owen around while you were
carried the
on
Owen
deployment?
initially until it was replaced. As I said, around about August after the Battle of Long Tan, all of a sudden there was this wake-up call that, hang on, 9mm's not very appropriate other than in tunnels. And so, all the Owens were withdrawn and we were issued with M16s.
Gotcha. So you landed in Vietnam in a safe zone somewhere? And
Yeah, Vung Tau was pretty safe. I remember coming ashore there, and during the night the ship anchored late in the afternoon, early evening. We didn't go ashore straight away, but they started unloading stores straight away. And I remember coming ashore at the Vung Tau hard stand, and there were all these pallets with all our trunks on them, but they'd been dumped at low tide. And of course, somebody picked them up with a forklift and shifted them up further up the tide. And as we were landing, as the tide was coming in, I thought, oh, this is a good start. There's all our trunks. I recognised the markings on them as not my own personal one, but the unit markings. And I thought, anyway, when they turned up, eventually they were all full of seawater.
No.
It didn't matter. We didn't have terribly much in there, civvy clothes and stuff that you didn't expect to get access to straight away anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But it was well and truly salted by the time we got it.
So what did you do when you first arrived?
Well, we went into the sandhills of Vung Tau for acclimatisation. We had our advance party was there and 3 field troop that had been up since August the previous year working with 1 RAR. And they only had a couple of months to go before they came home. And they were already there, so they put us through a lot of that's where we started learning to do explosive ordnance disposal, and a lot of the, equipment that we hadn't had access to or had no American stuff in the main. And they gave us, time on working on that sort of things, tunnel, smoke generators, to blow down smoke into tunnels and things like that. Initially, not so much to get the enemy out, but for that smoke to come up to show air vents and other tunnels
and stuff.
Yeah, that was the theory. But of course, the smoke was so dense that you wouldn't want to be in the tunnel anyway. So you'd probably scarper if you could.
What were you trained for before you went? If EOD and stuff wasn't on the cards, what were you expecting?
Well, the byline for engineers is we make and we break. So we build bridges, we assemble flotation equipment, operate barges, dig holes, whether it's with plant or with hand tools, demolition, blowing down bridges, all those sorts of things were all part of our standard field engineer training. They call them combat engineers now, but in those days it was field engineer. And so what we were learning was just the subtle things that were in theatre training. And that went on in theatre for some time, and eventually a lot of that stuff was shipped back to Australia, so that blokes in Australia were getting taught in the reinforcement system, the replacement system, on how to use that stuff. So they already had a heads up on a lot of the gear that we were the new boys, and the system hadn't sort of fully geared up to the replacement idea. And because engineers chose, and some other corps chose, not to replace unit with unit, 1 field squadron and 17 construction squadron, the 2 main engineer units there, stayed in place and had individual replacements. So after 6 months, we started sending people home once they'd passed the 6-month mark. Not everyone, but a selection of all ranks went home and into the training system back home to teach more people. And replacements came in, so that after 12 months, we'd had a complete 100% turnover both with casualties, with sickness, with compassionate leave, and the deliberate replacement system, so that we constantly could provide a level of experience on the ground. Whereas when a new unit, a new gun battery or a new infantry battalion arrived on the ground, while they were highly trained, they weren't necessarily theatre aware, and they needed a bit of time to come up to full expectation. So we had this system whereby the typical subunit in support of infantry was what was called a combat engineer team. And a combat engineer team was a corporal or senior sapper and 6 people broken into 2 mini teams, right? 3 mini teams of 2. And in each of those mini teams, there would be a number 1 and a number 2, irrespective of rank. Right, the number 1 wasn't the most senior person; it was the most experienced person. So I went out on my first operations as a number 2 to a sapper or a lance corporal who was a number 1 to show me how to do it. So that it wasn't my rank making decisions; it was their experience that was dictating how we provided whatever momentary aspect of support was required. And even our senior warrant officer, the squadron sergeant major, when that changed over, he had the balls to go out and work with a lance corporal or corporal or someone as a number 2 to their very junior rank, because they were theatre trained. He wasn't. He knew a lot more stuff overall, but he didn't know the subtle nuances of how things got done, such as tunnel search or demolishing rice caches or booby trap disposal, all the things that we were now doing in droves. And it didn't take long. You didn't have to do too many ops before you picked up a good enough range to be able to go back to doing what your rank dictated.
Yeah. When you say op, how long would that last for?
Ops varied from 2 days to 20, 30 days sometimes.
Yeah.
It really was a variable thing. We didn't, as engineers providing support, we didn't dictate anything in that range. The only thing we dictated to was engineer operations. If we were building a road or building a gun position, building a airfield or a helipad or something like that, we set our own limits, and they were usually pretty fine. And but when we were supporting mostly infantry battalions or the cavalry squadron, we didn't have tanks at that stage. The tanks came later. But so if we were out with a cav troop or we were out with an infantry company or a battalion, then they dictated where we went, who we went with, how we were. We didn't sort of say, we don't want to go with Charlie Company, we'd rather go with Delta Company or Alpha Company or something like that. No, this is what, how many people you got? Okay, I want this number with that company, this number with that company, this number with that. And we just fell into line because we were there to support them. They weren't out. Later, when we got involved in the barrier minefield, which was purely an engineer operation except for the fences, we had infantry supporting us rather than us supporting the infantry. We were doing the minefield laying. They were on protection duties either side of the minefield, keeping Charlie away so that we didn't have to walk around with a weapon in our hand. We had our weapons nearby, but we were arming mines, so we were a bit busy. Yeah. And other times when we were doing tunnel search and things like that, again, they would be holding the surface area and we'd have people underground going around, a torch and a bloody pistol in one hand and praying like buggery that you didn't come across anybody.
You're trusting the other guys with your lives a lot of the time.
Well, the thing was that you even if you had a compass and you were plotting, I've gone left 10 degrees and this thing's bent now, I'm going up, I'm going down. Even if you were marking that down, and trust me, not a lot of that happened until after we really knew this complex was safe. You sure as hell were too busy to think about marking little changes of direction. So you come to a spot which went up and you think, well, that's going back to the surface. If you stuck your head out and they didn't know you were coming, you could get shot. Because our infantry people aren't expecting sappers to stick their heads out a hole in the ground. They're expecting to see a bad guy coming. And so you had to be really careful how you came back to the surface. But you had no idea whether you're going to be inside the perimeter or outside of it. There are all these variables, and this is...
Did you have something to stick up first to let them know or something?
You yelled. As soon as you saw skylights, so I'm down here. I'm Sapper bloggers from Charlie Company. Charlie Company, who's up there? Something like that. I mean, if you knew that, there were guys looking down at you through the hole, then that's fine. Wasn't so bad. We trained the Australian guys pretty well. Infantry, don't throw grenades into holes. For two reasons. We might have people in there, but probably not. But it sucks up the oxygen when the explosion occurs. And they were creating we never were able to teach the Yanks not to do that. I don't know how many of their tunnel rats got asphyxiated by oxygen deprivation because they chuck white phos, they'd chuck bloody HE grenades down, they'd chuck bloody CS grenades down. Hole in the ground.
When their own people are down there.
Well, they didn't know that they just assumed there's a hole, therefore it's Charlie in the ground. And, Charlie's going to come up and shoot me, so I want to stop him from coming up. So if I throw enough bad stuff down, he won't come up.
Was it just really bad communication?
Look, everyone shit cans the Yanks, but by and large they were very professional. But they also had a high turnover of people, and a lot of them were conscripts. And their draft system wasn't designed for the full range of education. Our conscripts, our national servicemen, were across the spectrum. We had educated guys, we had guys who hadn't finished high school, we had all sorts. But by and large, most of them had a proper education. The American draft system very much picked on the lower socio-economic side of the society. And so a lot of them were just cannon fodder, basically. And I'm not disparaging them. It's not their fault. That was just the way the system was set up. If you had money, you either got to Canada or you paid off the draft so you didn't get in, right? Didn't get called in. And, certain politicians made good mileage out of that. So a lot of the guys that one was interacting with, if I was attached to an American unit for a period, and I was full of admiration for the range of equipment they had and the size of the force and the whole structure. It was so much bigger than anything we had. But the quality of the soldiers varied so much more than it did in an Australian unit. Even our dumbest digger was usually head and shoulders above some of the soldiers that I was working with in American units. And not to say that they were dumb, they just didn't have the education or the training. They also went for specialisation. So we had a couple of American engineer units attached to us, and they were amazed that our soldiers, our plant operators, for example, could operate all the plant we had. Right? They would have a bulldozer operator, a grader operator, a front-end loader operator, a backhoe operator, a chainsaw operator. And when there was no chainsawing to be done, he just sat there and maintained his tools. What a waste. Come on, guys. This is not going to work. When I was attached to an American unit, 65th Engineers, part of 25th Infantry Division, and you get to see how this battalion, which is much bigger than an engineer squadron that we had at the time, had this amazing capability, but a fair bit of waste because people were specialist trained, and if there wasn't anything going that required that. So one stage we had the 500th Panel Bridge Company working with us to build this bridge over the Song Rai. And when they came there, they were experts at putting together the bailey. That's all they did. Their whole role in life was to plan, stock, build, and then go away having built a bridge. And then if there were no bridges to build or no bridges to be maintained, they had nothing to do. We didn't have that mentality. We had to have people doing stuff because we weren't big enough to have that luxury.
Yeah, it's probably still something similar.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the military has changed. I'm talking about something 60 years ago. It's probably changed dramatically. And I think Vietnam was different from more modern. It was essentially a draft army. I mean, the NCOs and the officers and some of the diggers were volunteers, but by and large, the rank and file were heavily draftees. And, some of them, their English was, they were Tex-Mex or they were, from some other country originally, and their English was barely. And chuck in the accents. And, of course, they thought we had an accent. I mean, to say, really, us having an accent? We speak the Queen's English. But, no, it was quite an experience working with the Americans. It was I'm glad I had the opportunity to do so, both in terms of them being attached to us and us being attached to them.
How long were you attached to them?
I had a month. What had happened was that Australia, before the Vietnam War, had an exchange program going where we had an Army engineer officer in this battalion in Hawaii, the 65th Engineers, part of 25th. And we had an exchange officer in one of our units here in Australia. The officer commanding one field squadron when we deployed in May, June of 66 had just come back he'd been promoted after coming back from Hawaii to command the squadron.
Okay.
So the commanding officer of the 65th Engineers at Cu Chi, in the same general area we were in, not close, but within 100 kilometres, say, was the same battalion commander that when Warren was the OPSO of his battalion on exchange. So, they got talking on the phone and said, it was a great opportunity to learn how your battalion worked. It's a shame we can't do something like that here. So they set up a 1 month exchange. We had 12 officers in our squadron. Every one of us got a 1 month rotation with the 65th, and they sent their people down. However, in the American Army, they weren't constrained. Remember I mentioned earlier about the 3 years as a second lieutenant?
Yep.
The Americans didn't have that. If you were a second lieutenant and you were any good, you got promoted 6, 8, 9, 10 months after you were commissioned to being a first lieutenant. If you weren't any good, you served a bit longer. We had this prescribed 3 years thing. So I'm the first second lieutenant to arrive in the 65th. Right? Up until then, they've had captains and lieutenants. Okay, this guy turns up. They call them butter bars because in their rank insignia it was a brass stripe thing on their collar that was brass, therefore they were a second lieutenant. If it was silver, they were a full lieutenant. And if it was 2 bars side by side, it was a captain and so on. Okay. Anyway, so I turn up, I've got 1 pip. Now, for a start, that confuses them because that looks like a star and their generals wear 1 star, 2 star, 3 star. So a bit of confusion there anyway with Australian rank. But a second lieutenant, and he's been commissioned for 2.5, nearly 2 years. He must be a dumbass.
Yeah.
How on earth are we going to be able to employ him if he's that bloody thick? They won't promote him. And it took a phone call from the CO to my officer commanding, Warren Lennon, to explain, look, he might be a long time in rank, but that's how we do it.
Yeah.
And they suddenly realised that I wasn't quite as, well, maybe I was dumb, but I wasn't quite as dumb as they were assuming I was going to be.
That was green. And then the other way around, so you had Americans working with you as well?
Yeah, well, we had
constant rotation.
Well, aside from this rotation in the 65th, we also had quite a number of other opportunities to work with Americans, both in terms of specialist trades and skills or specialist equipment that they brought in, and we operated side by side with them while they were using that equipment, say well boring or something like that.
Did you find the officers were more switched on than the?
Look, by and large, yes, but they were, because of that early promotion business, when the company I was attached to in 65th, the actual company commander had less commissioned time than I had. I was a second lieutenant. He was a lieutenant. He was a company commander. He was running 3 platoons, each commanded by a second lieutenant or a lieutenant, and his 2IC was another lieutenant. So their actual time in rank or experience since they were commissioned was quite low. And I think that paid some kind of a price in terms of their capability as well. I mean, they just didn't have the experience. We had a major commanding what was equivalent of a company, and a captain as a 2IC. Captain troop commanders were very much the common thing amongst us, with a lieutenant or a second lieutenant as their 2IC in the troop, the equivalent of their platoon. Yeah. So, there was that aspect to it. So the company commander, once he realised, and the battalion realised that I wasn't quite as dumb as I was expected to be as a long-term second lieutenant, occasionally he'd say something and I think, I can't say anything. It's not my job to criticise, but Jesus, this sounds risky. I'll give you an example. We were out on an operation up in the Tain Inn area, and we were developing an existing road. We were repairing it from bomb damage and culverts blown up and things like that. And there were a lot of mines that had been put in the road to get big, heavy vehicles, not the little cyclos and smaller vehicles. So, they could pass over it and wouldn't set it off. But if a truck came along or a tank or a heavy piece of equipment, boom, a bus even, they were just optimised towards blowing up a big vehicle rather than a little vehicle. So the locals could walk over it and not be put in danger. Mm-hmm. And on this particular day, part of the division operating in a separate area nearby, one of their tanks had run over an anti-tank mine of some sort and blown the road wheel off this M48, I think it was, and it was down. It was not movable, but they didn't have any engineers close by. So down through the command chain says, send some people up to give them a hand. Now, the armoured guy was smart and he kept everyone on the vehicles. Don't get off the vehicles because there's bound to be other mines around. That was the way they did it. And so we go up there, and instead of pulling up at a suitable distance away from it, this bloke drove right up beside the tank. This is a company commander, right, this lieutenant. And he was a smart guy, but he wasn't thinking. Mm. And I'm thinking, I wish I could tell him back off, Mm-hmm. At this stage, I was commanding what looked like an M113 armoured personnel carrier, but it's actually a flame-throwing armoured personnel carrier. So I was there driving that or commanding the troop of that. And he had a couple of Jeep loads or 30 hundredweight light truck with some soldiers in it, and they were going to clear the area of mines. But he drove right up to the vehicle. So if there was another mine right beside it, he could have been tat-arse. It just didn't make sense. And I'm holding back on. I'm in a 113 or in a tracked vehicle, and even I'm shy about going up there because we're full of flame. If we, we've got pressurised napalm and compressed air on it. If we hit it, we're one flash and we're ash. And so I wasn't going anywhere near any area that was covered with mines. So I said to the guys, we'll wait till the bloody combat engineers get out and clear the area. And we hung back and offered protection, but we weren't going right up to the vehicle, whereas he drove his Jeep right up to it, or had his driver drive his Jeep right up to it. And I thought at the time, that's not something I'd have done. And he was a couple of years older than me. He'd been in country about the same amount of time I'd been in. He just wasn't thinking.
Yeah, right.
And it didn't go bad, but by God, it could have done. But we found 6 mines in the general area where the tank had gone up.
How do you find a mine under the concrete?
You don't. Oh. The mine under concrete is usually in a culvert and it's set off remotely.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So those ones that are getting tanks and heavy vehicles?
Well, they were set with a pressure device, but this is not concrete road. These are dirt roads.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And the only concrete would be on a ford, for example, 20 metres of sort of like a soup bowl kind of drive in, drive out over a creek. That might be concrete.
Oh, yeah.
And that's probably pretty safe but you'd get the approaches either side of it when you're back onto the gravel part of the road.
So when you say repairing roads, you mean like repairing like holes that have been blown into dirt roads and stuff?
From either bombs or mines or things like that, or just erosion, just weather. The weather up there, you get a lot of rain. Yeah. And, if a drain gets blocked up or something like that, and roads get flooded, vehicles drive over it, they start to break the surface up, and the surface is just gravel, and it just needs to be graded and put back into shape, and the drainage fixed and the culvert unblocked from an animal or just foliage building up in it or something like that.
Yeah.
And so there were mines in the road. I'm not trying to explain that there were every 10 metres or anything like that, just periodically.
Randomly.
Just enough to make sure that you had to be careful. If you weren't careful, you were dead or someone was going to die.
Yeah.
And so we were very, what's the word? We were probably more shy about going into places without getting someone out with a mine detector or a prodder to have a bit of a look-see. And you never drove over rubbish on the road. If you saw something like a cardboard box, for example, even if it had been flattened out to look like it had been run over, that could be covering a mine or some kind of charge that if set off. Usually, nowadays explosive devices are set off sometimes with remote things like phones and stuff. We didn't have mobile phones in those days, so it was all cable. So it'd be a cable that covered up with dirt leading back to a tree or a shrub or something like that. And there's a guy in a hole in the ground there, and he's got a battery, and he just touches the wire to the battery, and boom, at the appropriate time. So that was the limit of remote. But some things were pressure. They operated purely and simply on a weight being applied to the thing, and if it was functionable, it would go bang.
Yeah. So where were you living when you were going out on these deployments and stuff?
Oh, in the main bases, we originally had 12 by 14 tents, and then eventually we were building rudimentary timber and galvanised iron sheds to live in. In the American base, they were well established. They had, all of the soldiers were living on Kuchi base in timber and corrugated roof huts.
Were they pretty safe from enemy attacks? Or?
No. Around our things, we'd put up about less than half a metre of sandbags, and you would sleep below that edge when we're in the tents.
Yeah.
When we were in the huts, you build it up to probably a metre, right, and around, and you'd be sleeping below that. But if one came in, you were gone anyway. So that was, there's no
shrapnel protection.
Well, if mortar comes down vertically and goes inside the sandbags, then you rat shit anyway. But that was the odds of that happening were pretty minimal.
Yeah.
But the other thing about that meant that those sandbags around the tents and around the buildings meant that the ground never dried out around them. So they became rodent infested. They became very mildewy. Everything had this pong of, damp, mildewy smell about it. And even years later, the stuff we brought home, washed countless number of times, it still had that pong about it, just ingrained into the fibres, I think, and probably into my skin as well. But no, when I was living in a tent, we had some pallets. We had very low cot stretcher type thing. Back in base, that was quite comfortable. But as I said, because of the circulation, they were hot and sticky in the hot weather, and it was very hot sometimes, very humid. But also, there were shitloads of rats and God knows what. Even if you had no food around, it was just a great place. So when you shifted a tent and you pulled up the bloody pallets and stuff like that, you couldn't believe the livestock was living underneath it, including snakes and other things, we were in Neweydat, we were in a rubber plantation, and there were still plenty of snakes around. One night I walked into my tent, and the other guy that I shared the tent with at this stage, he was on duty overnight in the command post, and we had electric light. You button up the tent completely, and then you turned the light on, and I had this feeling of a pair of eyes looking at me, and in a box with some my uniforms and things, there's this pair of eyes looking at me. I thought, oh, shit. And I could see from it that it was what was called a banded crate. They're quite a small snake with a very small mouth, and while they're highly venomous, their mouth is so small that they, couldn't bite you on the leg, but they could bite you on the tail or the hand or something like that because they have very small mouth, like sea snakes. And anyway, so I'd started to strip by the time I'd realised this thing was watching me. And the story as told by the signallers in the command post was that a certain officer arrived at the door of the command post with no dacks on, a pair of boots, a bayonet in one hand and a machete in the other, screaming for help. Now, I deny that emphatically. I believe that's a figment of their imagination. Anyway, one of the SIGs grabbed hold of the machete from me, figured I could do less damage with a bayonet than I could with a machete, and he came back over then, by which time the snake is moving from one box into another. And he takes an almighty sweep with his thing, misses the snake completely with the machete, cleaves my friend's peak cap in half in the process, which he didn't wear up there anyway. But and the snake disappeared into the sandbags, and I lay awake all night worrying about it.
Oh no, a bit worse than a mosquito.
Oh
in your
yeah,
room.
oh yeah. We had mozzie nets, but geez, I tell you what, it wasn't going to keep a snake out.
Anybody get bit?
No, it just obviously found better pickings elsewhere. But I was
They're there for the rats.
I was
obviously.
certainly I was certainly concerned that night. By the next night, I forget. Oh no, I think I was on duty the following night, so I didn't have to go in the tent. And the night after that, I'd forgotten about it. I mean, life goes
So
on.
much else going on.
Yeah.
Cool. So did you get many attacks when you were on base?
No, the only main attack was the night of the 17th of August, where the task force came under mortar, rocket, and 75mm artillery fire, which we didn't. We in the broader range of troops had no idea about, but apparently we had Sneaky Pete signallers who were tracking, using electronic warfare, they were tracking this force coming in, but they didn't want to tell anyone that they were coming. The signallers briefed the commanders and the need-to-knows. The rest of us were in, mushrooms. We fed on bullshit and kept in the dark. Anyway, this stuff came in, and initially I slept through it because we had a gun battery right beside us anyway. And when they fired H&I, harassment and interdiction fire, during the night, they'd let off 2 or 3 rounds just to fire into a track crossing or a creek crossing or something like that. Random fire just to keep Charlie on his toes. Yeah. And so I was used to things going bang in the night and just slept through it. Anyway, this was incoming and I didn't twig. And so I got woken up to start doing the notification of casualty forms and things like that, which was my mini jobs. And they said, "How come you slept through that?" I said, "Slept through what?" I really didn't know the extent of what had happened. And it was still actually happening, but by which time my awareness was starting to become acute. Geez, this is dangerous. And we took a number of occasions. One of our troop commanders wore an 82mm mortar in his bed, lost his leg. We had other guys injured, tents damaged, and the idea was that you just got out of your space and crawled into your hole in the ground. If you're on the actual edge of the position, we had people in doing sentry duty and stuff like that. So they were the first line of defence. But
how big's a position?
Oh, the whole task force occupied many, many acres. Probably 1,000 acres.
Okay,
it was a big, well spread out, and but not necessarily fully manned because if you had battalions out in the field and cav out in the field doing stuff, quite a lot of this was skeletal management. Wasn't a lot of manning in some places.
So just firing randomly into the...
there was nothing to fire at. When people are shooting artillery into you, there's really not much you can do other than pull your head in and wait for it to finish. But the following day, the companies were sent out, or some companies were sent out to go looking for the base plate positions and things like that. And that led to the Battle of Long Tan. But we were more interested in the fact that there was a Cold Joy concert on that afternoon. And, we were looking forward to that. And, Cold Joy, Little Paddy, Lorraine Desmond and Jacqueline, I can't remember her other name. Yeah, that was much higher on our priorities, because we didn't know that there was a threat to the task force. Nobody told us. And there was a concert coming on, so it can't be any threat, really, can there? And anyway,
so they still came.
But they did, and but we were doing what was called crater analysis, or the gunners were going around doing crater analysis and showing us, how to recognise the direction that the mortar had come from or the gun round from looking at the crater. And that was interesting, but not something that we could use. But and so they'd worked out where the base plates were from the mortars that had attacked us, and a rough idea where the guns were, but they had no idea what range they were firing on. And anyway, so the companies of infantry were out searching for these things, and the concert goes ahead, and then it starts to rain. And just as it starts to rain, all hell breaks loose. There's guns firing crazy. The artillery were going absolutely apes. And this is disturbing the music. This is not good. The concert can't proceed if it's raining too heavily and the guns are firing too much. There must be something on. So basically, so switch off concert, switch on, maybe there's a problem.
Yeah.
And, of course, this is the start of the Battle of Long Tan.
Oh, wow. So you're right there.
Oh, not at the battle site, but at the gun end of it. And we had no part to play in it. Our engineers were not in any way, shape or form involved in the actual fighting itself. However, the guns were using up ammunition at a prodigious rate.
How many guns were there?
Well, we had 18 105 guns and 6 155 American guns. And they started to run out of ammo at some stage after dark. They were using up their on-site supply. And we had started to build Luscombe Field, which was a fixed-wing airstrip in the middle of the position. But it wasn't ready to take fixed-wing aircraft. So they were bringing in underslung Chinook loads of ammunition, and we had tip trucks, so we had lots of them. So we had all our tip trucks lined up in the dark on the airfield, and the chooks would come in over us with a pallet of 105 ammo, and they just drop the thing onto the back of the tip truck. The AD guys would get up and strip all the strapping and stuff off, jump off the truck, bang the side, and you'd head off. And then as you left the yet-to-be-finished airfield, pass by a sapper checkpoint that had a radio, go to 103 battery, number 6 gun. So they go to 103 battery and they would tip the pallet load of ammunition right beside the gun, all right? And then they'd drive back and get on the end of the queue and wait for the next load. And, that's what we spent most of the night doing, was resupplying the guns. I mean, I didn't have any role to play whatsoever. As I said, I was, pretty much, because the transport guys, our tipper transport guys were running that whole operation. They did a magic job, totally unsung, because nobody ever thinks about, if you've got gunfire going out, someone's got to replace the ammunition sometime. So the people down in Vung Tau, maybe I don't know, Vung Tau, where the stuff was coming from, palletising or moving pallets onto a landing strip so that the chooks could come in, pick up a hook and fly up to Nui Dat and line up along Luscombe Field, aim for a tip truck, lower the thing onto the back of it and go back for more. And that went on for hours, because there was a lot of ammunition going out.
Yeah.
And by which stage I think any enemy were well out of range, but I think it was a bit of psychological firing too.
Did they do was the movie pretty accurate in that, you think?
What, Danger Close?
The Kiwi artillery there.
The Kiwi artillery guy, Stanley, Murray Stanley, he was the FOO, Forward Observation Officer. He was very critical to the operation. I mean, he did a magnificent job. He and his gun offside, or bombardier, I think. There are a couple of things about there that I nearly threw up, not because of horror, just how can... Even with Harry Smith, the company commander, as a technical advisor on that movie, the directors still put bullshit in by the bloody bucket load. And, I was not happy with, and most of the people I've spoken to have any involvement, the portrayal of Brigadier Jackson, the portrayal of Colonel Townsend, the battalion commander, Harry Smith getting punched in the face by some digger. Harry would have shot him dead on the spot. I mean, I just can't believe that was allowed to get through. It's just crap.
Did you know all those guys personally?
Yeah. Well, one of my classmates was one of the platoon commanders in there, in Delta Company, and another one of my classmates was in Charlie Company, which weren't out that time. So, a lot of the second lieutenants in the battalions were people I'd trained with, and I'd gone on a lot of ops, and a lot more to follow after that with these blokes. So I didn't know all of them, but I knew a lot of them, and I knew Harry Smith because I'd seen him around, and I regarded him very highly. I think he was a remarkable man.
So the one that Travis Femmel played?
I can't remember the name. When Jeff Kendall, who's 10 platoon commander, he died late last year, I think it was. The actor who played his part in Danger Close came to the funeral. Oh, yeah. And I thought that was really good. He was that close. They'd obviously spent time together talking
Got
about
to know each other.
Yeah. So, but the portrayal of Gordon Sharp, who was the platoon commander that was killed, was abominable. You know, they showed him as a bloody glitzy, card-playing shitbag, really. If I was the Sharp family, I'd have sued.
Yeah.
I really would. I mean, that portrayal was unforgivable. You know, okay, so he might have liked playing cards. I don't know. I didn't know him that well. He was a National Service officer. But, you know, to portray him as the shitbag that he was when he was killed in that battle, to my mind, was just, Hollywood gone berserk, even if it wasn't Hollywood.
Yeah, just trying to make a story for a movie without realising that.
I've been involved in a little bit of technical advising on some productions, not a lot, but eventually the director says, I don't care. It may not be realistic, but I don't care. This is what sells movies. And we're not making this for the veteran population. We're making this for the broader public. And they don't know. Give you an example. The most explosions you see on movies and TV, shitloads of petroleum product in it to make a big flashy flame. Throw a hand grenade and it looks like 44-gallon drums of bloody petrol's just gone up. Grenades don't do that.
No,
you get a flash, you get a bang, and you get some smoke.
Some dirt.
And some dirt. It is not a very spectacular looking thing, but it can still kill you. But no, they don't want that. They want, so they add, jerry can of diesel or something to it to make sure that it'll flash and look quite spectacular. When you say, hell, that's not real. I don't care. That's what sells movies,
Yeah. Well, they all do it now because they've set the standard.
There can't be a standard HE explosion any longer in movies. It must be written into the director's manual. Thou shalt not be realistic. Make it look pretty.
It's too late. There's no going back.
Nah.
So anyway, Battle of Long Ten, the real one, and what then? I know you got obviously you're quite famous for the flamethrower stuff that you mentioned before.
That was only a 1 month attachment, and as I said, they didn't know what to do with me when I arrived in 65th, so they had surplus to their establishment for flame tracks, which they'd been given to protect their quarrying operation. In Coochie, they had a quarry operating 24 hours, 7 days a week, and it was floodlit at night. And, of course, it was an obvious target. So this massive great earthen berm built around the outside of it, and they'd parked the 4 flame tracks inside that berm but outside of the way of where the quarry operation was happening. And they'd stick their head up or go turret up, give a squirt and drop back and move left or right randomly all through the night. So if Charlie wanted to come in and snipe the guys operating the quarry, the truck drivers or the machinery operators and things like that, they might have got a squirt of flame in their face and they stayed away. There was never an attack on the quarry.
Okay.
And ironic because, subsequent to the war, we found out that underneath Coochie, the base that I'm talking about, was a massive pile of tunnels. So Charlie was downstairs while the Yanks were upstairs. And, the Vietcong was smart enough not to show their hand, and they just used it for when they needed to. The Yanks didn't twig that they had tunnels underneath them. Yeah, they knew there were tunnels in the Hobo Woods and the Boiler Woods and the other parts of the Iron Triangle, but they had no idea at that time, certainly in 1966, 67 when I was there, that there were tunnels under Coochie. I don't know when they found out, but I'm inclined to bet that it was after the war was over.
Sneaky. So you were labelled as one of these tunnel rats. What does that involve?
When 3 Field Troop went up in August of 1965 to work with 1 RAR as part of an American brigade, they were operating over a wide-ranging area with those American forces. And they started to find tunnel complexes. And the American attitude was throw grenades and stuff down it. If Charlie's down there, he'll either be dead or he'll come out and we'll shoot him or take him prisoner. A bloke called Sandy McGregor was the troop commander for 3 Field Troop, and he went down into a tunnel that had been found that hadn't been contaminated by Allied grenades and smoke and stuff. And he found a lot of useful intelligence. And they started to put the word out within 173rd and then subsequently other formations, that instead of blowing these things up, let's put some people down there and have a look and see what we can find. And during Operation Crimp, which was in February, I believe February of 1966, in which we lost a soldier. Corporal Botel was in the hole. It was too narrow for him and he got jammed and he couldn't get out and he asphyxiated. And by the time they got him out, he was dead. And so I was still back in Australia at this stage. So I was shot off to the mine school in the Hunter Valley to do a short, sharp introduction to tunnel rescue. I mean, get real. Mm-hmm. The gear they gave us was wonderful for walking around in a big tunnel. Useless in these tunnels because we just physically couldn't fit ourselves, let alone any rebreather gear and stuff like that.
Oh, so these tunnels are so narrow.
Oh, they're very narrow. And the ones you go into now that are touristy at Coochie have been Europeanised. They've been made big for big people. These other ones were minuscule. Now, I was only a weed of a kid at this stage. When I came home from Vietnam, I was 54 kilos.
Holy shit.
And so, I was a skinny little shit. And I wasn't much bigger earlier on, but I was a whole lot less when I come home. So before I went up there, I was designated as admin officer. I would be in charge of the tunnel rescue team. So I trained up a couple of the guys around the headquarters. So whenever tunnels were found by the Australians, we would be put on alert initially. If people were going to go into the tunnels, then we would deploy closer to them or sit by our own helipad, Wombat Pad, waiting for a chopper to come pick us up and take us out if we were needed to rescue anyone. And it happened very rarely. I mean, we found a lot of tunnels, but we weren't called very often. And none of us did a tunnel rescue. We had the capacity, albeit limited, but we weren't used. So it became quite the standard thing to explore tunnels. And there were lots of them, and some of them were very long and some of them were very big. I mean, the passageways might have been as narrow as, but sometimes there were classrooms, medical facilities, workshops, all sorts of things underground. I mean, these tunnels were being built back in Japanese times, Viet Minh times against the French, and added to as a result of Viet Cong activity against the American War, as they call it. And, these things were very important because a lot of useful stuff could be got out of them. And, aside from equipment, intelligence information. So it was certainly worthwhile checking them out. And even though often you would get nothing, it was still one of those things that you just had to do. And training people, as I mentioned earlier, not to throw stuff in to contaminate the air was part of our survival.
So when you say the contamination with HE or
anything that creates a flame is going to consume oxygen, and if there isn't a ventilation system, and they relied on natural ventilation, they didn't have air pumps or fans or anything else like that. So being underground, you didn't get a lot of fresh air. It was very stale. So if you consumed the oxygen and turned it into carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, you were making it pretty hard to live in. So there would
be no amount of time that would make it safe to go in?
In time it would ventilate with. But keep in mind, they wanted to keep these tunnels entrances secret, so they weren't open caves or anything else like that. So you might have what appears like a weapon pit inside a hut, which could be used by the hut occupants as a shelter in case there was an air raid on or something like that. But it's got a little tunnel leading off it. That might be all you see. And it might have something parked on it or a bit of rag hanging over it or something like that to make it less obvious. But when you go looking in them, hang on, there's a bit of a passageway. It might only be a sleeping bay, but it looks like a tunnel. It's probably a tunnel. And under some of those villages, there were extensive tunnels. And not all of them rendered usable information, but enough of them did to make this a very worthwhile project. And the Americans developed tunnel rats at the same time extensively. They eventually they twigged that there was useful info too.
Part of what you're a little whippet, you got sent down there a lot of the time.
I didn't personally. I didn't do an awful lot of tunnel. As I said, I was earmarked for tunnel search and tunnel rescue, I should say. Whereas the tunnel search guys, that was all of the combat engineers. They were out. And in those days, our field troop didn't consist of just what we today call combat engineers, we call field engineers. We had tradies in the troops. We had drivers. We had plumbers. We had electricians. We had carpenters. We had drivers and plant operators and things like that. And they were in the tunnels the same as the field engineers were. You know, they were out in a combat engineer team, mini team or a splinter team. They were doing the same work. And some of them were big buggers, so they were a bit chubby. They weren't much use in tunnels, and they'd be used for other things. But on the ship going up, it was a funny experience. We had this strange-looking captain. He looked uncomfortable and un-officer-like. And it turned out he was a scientist from the Weapons Research Establishment. I think it's in South Australia. And the Americans had used this thing called the Mighty Mite, which was a way of pumping exhaust fumes into a tunnel after you'd exhausted all the useful information you might get out of it, and then using it to deny the tunnel or to ignite it, if possible, to blow the tunnel up. The other thing we did was use CS grenades, which is tear gas in a solid form in the tunnels to impregnate the side walls and the roof and the floor to make it untenable for people for a period of time. It didn't last forever, but it lasted for a long time. Mm. So in Australia, they thought we're going to outdo the Mighty Mite. So these scientists in weapons research came up with a helicopter Iroquois motor, right, in this massive great steel skid thingo to protect it. And when you cranked it up and you took the exhaust from it down into the tunnel with ducting, and you put a 44-gallon drum of diesel beside it and opened this valve to suck in vapour of diesel down the hole along the tunnel under this massive pressure from the exhaust of the helicopter motor, it would infiltrate the tunnel with this highly explosive gas mix. And then there was a piezo igniter, which you pulled from a safe distance and it was supposed to set it off. Well, what happened was the bloody helicopter motor went up and up and up and oh my God, it's coming down and down. Run! It was very
Shot
airborne.
it into the air.
Yeah. Helicopter motor without helicopter wants to fly, won't. Anyway, that was an experiment. It got used a couple of times, but it wasn't as successful as it was planned and hoped to be. But
those big flamethrowers on the tracks that you was protecting the base with, you were firing them down to clear out tunnels as well?
No. We did use them as convoy escorts when the quarry was having a lay day of equipment being maintained or something like that, or when it was too rainy to operate. The tracks were often used for convoy escort, and it was that we were doing when that incident I mentioned earlier about the tank running over the mine up in Tain Inn. Oh, yeah. And we were out escorting this road maintenance program that we were conducting in that area. And the Americans have a different policy of fire by recon, or recon by fire, sorry. They're going along a road and they see a clump of bushes 100 metres back off the road, so they brass it up on the off chance that there might be a bad guy in it that means some harm. We don't have that philosophy. We have the philosophy that we try and aim fire. You kill someone by shooting them with one round if you can. Yeah. And so we were trained one shot, one kill. So just blazing away doing nothing wasn't part of our ethos. And the Americans had a very different flame. So when we were in the flame tracks, it was flame instead of just 50 cal stuff. Oh, dear God. And, you were just brassing up. Yeah, it had about 170 metres of range. Yeah. So, you could do a fair amount of, you get a fair way off the road with that. I mean, that's when everything was pressurised. It started to diminish as we run down on fuel and compressed air.
So when you were with the Yanks, they were getting you to fire it off into the bush all the time.
And we would brass up anything that was off the side of the road because that's what they wanted. And, it wasn't up to me to say, hang on, no, we don't do it that way. I'm with an American unit. We do it American unit way. When they were with us, they had to shut up when they were out in the bush. So if we had a troop if we had American, we call them sappers, but, combat engineers or whatever they want to call them, private soldiers and the American engineers working with us, we're out with the infantry. You kept your mouth closed. You didn't talk. You made no noise. We tippy-toed through the scrub. We sent hand signals, sort of, you didn't, hey, Charlie, come here, And the Americans, when they're moving through the scrub, they're yelling like buggery.
Really?
Yeah. And keep up on the left. You're dropping back. Come on, you guys. And, it was a noisy thing. And they figured that was the big, the alpha male kind of thing. I'm big and strong and I'll herd these bastards out of the way if they get involved. And they saw us as being cowardly, tippy-toeing through the scrub, hoping we wouldn't get shot at. Well, we thought, no, we'd learned in Malaysia and Borneo and places like that you tippy-toe, and New Guinea before it, you tippy-toe through the scrub and you surprise the other bugger if you can.
Yeah.
And while you're talking, you're not necessarily looking and listening, and that often gives a person away. And smell. In the bush, smell is so important. The Yanks would have, they clean their teeth with toothpaste, they'd use deodorant, they'd smoke.
Punching durries, yeah.
And that's, smell carries a very long distance. Our blokes didn't use toothpaste or deodorants or anything else like that. We didn't even wash. Part of the reason was because in the water sometimes there was leptospirosis, which is a snail-like, very, very tiny little thing that burrows into any gap in your skin or other opening in your body, and not pleasant, and it's potentially lethal. I mean, they really get hold of you and get into you.
I think you'd want to be dead if it went into some holes.
Yeah, but so often, when we're crossing creeks and things like that, you got out of it as quick as you could, and hope that your long trousers or whatever shirt you're wearing would keep the buggers out. But and so. We didn't wash. I was with one company at one stage and they had a no-wash policy from the minute you stepped out of Neweydat. And, after 27 days, man, But interestingly enough, the rate of skin infection amongst those guys was much lower because your body secretes oils and other things and natural, animals don't wash regularly and they get by. And this guy
ask you that if there was many infections.
Well, yes, there was. We had a lot of problems. At one stage, whereas malaria was our paranoia in the most, we were absolutely fixated on preventing mozzies. Well, malaria mozzies particularly. There are other mozzies that don't carry malaria. And so we were fixated on this. And then someone discovered that people were getting encephalitis or encephalitis, depending on which school you went to. And it was carried by a mosquito as well. And so what they were on about was that all day now we were going to wear long sleeves, whereas it was after dark you wore long sleeves and long trousers. During the day, if you were around the base, you might have a pair of shorts on, a pair of boots and a giggle hat and you didn't have a shirt or anything. But now, because of this encephalitis-carrying mosquito, suddenly we have to wear long sleeves all the time. Now, the guys on plant and driving heavy equipment, things like that, sweating buckets. And so we started getting all these ring tinea things. It's not like tinea as in the white flaky stuff, dandruff and so on. These were lesions about the size of a 50-cent coin and very uncomfortable, itchy and also painful.
Anywhere on the body?
All over, because we were just sweating. And then the guys go home and shower and wash off any natural, whereas the guys who are out in the bush sometimes who went these prolonged periods without washing maybe we're not quite so susceptible to it, even though they were wearing longs and everything all day as well. Anyway, so we had to manage that as a separate issue, and eventually, because a lot of these things are seasonal, that mosquito disappears after a while because they cycled out of their normal operating period, and. But it was we did have a lot of skin problems, and nearly all of us came home with what we call crutch rot. It was both crutches and underarms, so you're standing there constantly scratching. My wife used to get endlessly embarrassed. We'd be at a family thing like that, and I'd be sitting there scratching my nuts, and it was not the sort of thing that polite society did. But you see a bunch of guys standing around in the mess or an OR's canteen or something like that. They're all back from Borneo or from Malaysia or from Singapore or something like that, all standing there scratching, totally unaware of the fact they're doing it, and nobody gives a crap. Nobody's saying, "Oh, guys, would you mind just not scratching your nuts? You're disturbing the locals."
Cool. I know there's one story that's you quite has been gone around with you and your other mate John Jethro.
Yep. Yeah, that's
Is that
right.
something you're comfortable talking about?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. In about March, late March, early April of 67, the new task force commander, Brigadier Stuart Graham, decided that he wanted to build an anti-personnel minefield to cut the province or part of the province in half. And there was a feature just about at the limit of 105 gun range called the Horseshoe near a big village, really a big town, called Dat Doe. So it was decided to occupy, they temporarily occupied it at different times for a fire support base, but they were going to put a permanent company out there. So, efforts were made to fortify the Horseshoe. And it was called a Horseshoe because on a map it was an old volcanic crater, the side of which had blown out. So the contours made it look like a horseshoe. Mm-hmm. And open at the south facing towards Dat Doe township. And then once that was occupied and we put in a couple of anti-personnel protective minefields to close the big gap at the bottom and a smaller gap at the top, with M16 mines, that we would build a barrier minefield. Now, in mine warfare jargon, you have protective, defensive, and barrier minefields, and decoy or phony minefields. They're the sort of the genres that you operate within. Protective are really close in, right in front of the gun positions, basically to stop that last minute bloody surge of people into your front line. Mm-hmm. A defensive minefield would link up two company positions that there's a gap between. You'd put a minefield in to stop small parties infiltrating between your positions. Barrier minefields are usually short-term to deflect a major force on something like that. Mm. We're never intended to be a semi-permanent or permanent thing. The difficulty with all minefields is that they are useless unless they're covered by observation and fire. So the deal was that the province chief, an army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN as we called it, guy, he said, that's okay, I'll get a regiment of ARVN here to provide that oversight, covering it by fire, covering it by observation to stop the bad guys getting through. So my boss had changed from Warren Lennon now to a bloke called Brian Florence, and Brian fronted the task force commander and said, "Boss, this is not a good idea. We can't rely on the ARVN guys, and we are really making a problem for ourselves in the future." Now, interestingly enough, Stuart Graham didn't consult with the two battalion commanders, Colonel Waugh of 5 RAR and Colonel Townsend of 6 RAR, both of whom had served in Korea, in the latter part where there were a lot of minefields and a lot of problems. Mm. And they were definitely not pro-minefield. And Brian Florence, our boss, had spent a lot of time doing bomb disposal after the war, including getting rid of a lot of mines. So he was certainly not a big fan of mines in that sort of wild context that Stuart Graham wanted. Mm. So anyway, cut a long story short, he got his way. He was going to build this 11-kilometre long barrier minefield, about 100 plus metres wide. There were two really strong concertina wire fences which ran on the outside of it, linking up the Horseshoe and the coast. And the idea was, Stuart Graham's idea was, to stop the enemy getting access to the villages in Dat Doe and the other villages along that line. Trouble was, they were the enemy. Mm. They were very pro-VC and probably friendly during the day and bad guys during the night. And he didn't twig that. And there had been similar minefields built in Algeria by the French and the McNamara line up on the demilitarised zone at the top end of South Vietnam. And they had moderate levels of success, but they had people watching them all the time. Anyway, the regiment that was eventually allocated from ARVN to protect this thing arrived after they'd been badly mauled up in the demilitarised zone, brought down to Phuoc Tri province to reorganise and rebuild. So a regiment's usually 3 battalions of 500-700 men each, maybe 2,000 plus. I think there were about 300 turned up. They were really, really a skeletal unit. But don't worry, they're going to build up. We're going to regroup this. It'll be a new unit, no time flat. As fast as a company or a battalion got up and trained, they got shifted out to be reinforcements for someone else. So this regiment never really quite materialised. But on went the minefield sowing. To make it harder for the bad guys, they decided that wouldn't just be the M16 jumping jack mine, it would have an M26 grenade with an M5 pressure release fuse on top of it underneath each mine, as far as we could get. With 22,000 mines planned to be laid, we could only get 15,000 M5 switches. So 2/3 were going to be anti-lift and the rest were going to be take your chances.
So they shoot up and pull the
Well, what happens if you
go.
disturb the mine, even if you try and put a safety pin into the mine to stop the mine from going off, if you move that mine more than a couple of millimetres either side, the grenade would go off underneath it, blowing the mine and the grenade and the mine up and killing whoever was fiddling with the mine.
So
that was the theory.
How would they get rid of them after the war?
Nobody thought of that. I'm pretty sure there was no discussion at that early stage about lifting this thing.
So keep going.
Anyway, so we'd laid the protected minefields around Horseshoe using predominantly field engineers in the field troop that I was part of. And most of the tradies were back in Neweydat. The rest of the troop was 60-odd men, 2 officers and 63 other ranks. So it was a big unit, big subunit. And the FEs were out with me, field engineers, and the tradies were by and large back in Neweydat building stuff, roads and buildings and concrete and all sorts of stuff. But we were told that we had to lay 1,000 mines a day to get this barrier minefield finished quickly.
Sounds like a lot.
It's a shitload. And a troop of 60-odd men would be flat out achieving that by themselves. But I didn't have the whole troop. I only had part of the troop at this stage. At this point, when we did the protective minefields around Horseshoe, my actual captain boss, I was a second lieutenant, as I said, and my captain at that stage was off on R&R, out-of-country leave. And when he came back, he then resumed command in time to start the main barrier minefield. And we started laying it, and the day we started it, we had no problems, but Graham Moon was my troop commander, the captain, and he said, Joe, I want you to go back to the Horseshoe and do such a, I can't remember what the task was, but I was needed back in the Horseshoe. So my driver and I jumped in the Land Rover and we beetled up through Datto village out towards the Horseshoe. We were some distance away at this stage. We didn't start at the Horseshoe and work south. We started at the bottom end of Datto village and worked back towards the Horseshoe for whatever reason, I can't remember. And anyway, that day, the 2nd of May, 1967, driving back, I've just left Datto. We've got about a click maybe to the Horseshoe. It's fairly close. It's open country. I can see it. Just as we cleared the last house in the village, I see a puff of smoke and hear a bang a second or so later from the direction of the Horseshoe. And I look there and it's smack bang near where one troop's part of the defensive line around the Horseshoe. And I wasn't sure whether it was a mortar, a ranging round of a mortar or what it was. I just said to Blue, my driver, I said, hang on, mate, we'll wait here and see what happens, expecting to see some other fire start to come in. We waited maybe a minute and couldn't see any other further rounds coming in. So we said, come on, let's go. So we headed for the Horseshoe. And when I got there, around the entranceway, right beside one of our protective minefields, there's a gaggle of guys in a vehicle, American vehicle. Earlier that day, the battery of self-propelled 155mm guns, it was B battery of the 2nd of the 35th American artillery, had come into the position, and previously they'd occupied the area where this protective minefield was when they'd been there for a fire support base previously. I knew the battery commander. We'd done other stuff together. So as you can hear them coming up the road. I mean, there's 6 big bloody self-propelled guns on track, so they're not going to sneak in. So I walked down, 40, 50 metres onto the road that was entranceway, which we were right beside, and said to this guy, hey, look, where you were previously, it's now a minefield. It's marked in accordance with NATO standards. You know the ropes as well as I do, I'm sure. And Major O'Brien, the Alpha Company 6 RAR, who were the main force in the horseshoe, he's got your new position worked out, so you just go up to him and he'll show you where the guns are to go. And I left him at that, and away I went. We went out and started laying mines. When I came back, what happened was that the word didn't get down to all the soldiers in the battery. And so a sergeant and a couple of their gunners climbed through the fence into the minefield to recover defence stores that they could see, timber and galvine and sandbags and other things, which were inside the wire of the minefield. And he stepped on the first mine, just about the first mine he came to, bang. So he's missing bits of legs and he's lying there thrashing on the ground in pain. Now, I wasn't here at that moment. This is rebuilding what I had explained to me later.
Was that the bang you had?
That was the bang I saw. He'd walked on a mine. As I said, no big flash of petrol going off. It was just a grey, smoky thing. Yeah. And dirt and stuff in the air, and could have been a mortar, could have been a grenade, could have been anything.
Yeah.
And anyway, I drove up, and there were so many people doing stuff. It was pointless me getting involved. I just sort of stood back, and I recognised one of my soldiers inside the minefield sitting on this wounded sergeant. Right now, I won't go into a lot of technical details, but mines are laid in a pattern. And if you think of a half circle with a mine in the centre of the circle, a mine at 12 o'clock, a mine at 6 o'clock, and a mine at 9 o'clock, and that's a cluster. On the other side of the centre line will be, so many paces forward, will be another mine in the centre, a mine at 12 o'clock, a mine at 6 o'clock, and a mine at 3 o'clock. So you've got these little half circles truncated off to the side of the centre line of the mine strip.
Yeah.
They're into the lesson on mine laying. And this is all NATO stuff. This is not Australia's way of doing things. This is all well recognised from, lessons learned in World War II.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's trodden on the middle mine in this cluster. So there are now 3 other armed mines without anti-lift device armed around him. And he's thrashing about in the ground in pain, and he's not thinking. So I had 3 sappers back in the position unpacking mines out of boxes and checking fuses and things like that, because some of them were a bit waterlogged, had been in storage and things like that. So that's what they were doing. And they'd heard the bang. They were only 70 paces away from where the thing went off. And they ran down. They're standing outside the fence. Now, it turned out there's 3 of them. One's married, one's engaged or going steady or whatever, and the other one doesn't have a girlfriend. So they did a bit of democracy and decided the one who didn't have a girlfriend would go inside the minefield and sit on this guy until help came.
So what do you mean sit on him? Like
literally sit on him to stop him setting off the other mines.
Stop him moving around.
So there's Saparinas there sitting on Sergeant Prado. Sergeant Prado is not a happy camper. He's totally he's conscious, but he's certainly not aware of what's going on around him.
Yeah.
And this guy is sitting on him to stop him when I turn up. Right, and as I said, outside the wire, there's stacks of people, far too close for safety. But anyway, one of the other guys with Prado, there was 2 other gunners. One of them is so badly injured, he died on the helicopter going, and he was outside the fence. And now there's all this gaggle of A Company 6 RAR guys and stuff standing around gawking at this operation. Not good. Anyway. I'm leading up to Jethro. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
And anyway, and there's a guy halfway between the fence and where Saparinas is sitting on this bloke. And I'm thinking, what's he going in? And it turned out he was the company medic, and he was going in to inject Prado with morphine. calm him
Did all
down.
these guys that are coming in know where the mines were?
No, there's no one else inside the fence except Prado, casualty, Innes, not casualty, sitting on him, and
Medic.
Private Buckwalter going in, David Buckwalter going in to knock him out. What Innes is doing is getting guys to flick in their giggle hats, the little green cloth hats, and he's putting the hats over the mines,
Oh, yeah.
right? Didn't have time to arm them, couldn't disarm them while he was sitting on Prado. So he was just marking them. Once they were marked, they could then bring in a stretcher and zonk him out with morphine, put him on the stretcher, get him out and get him on a chopper and get him down to suitable hospital. Okay, so this all happens, and subsequently Innes got a military medal for it. I won't go into all the gory details, but and that was a separate incident. That's on the 2nd of May. It was a bit disarming, and the other thing we found, as we laid the minefield between the 2nd and the 9th, we had the bad guys putting dogs, even a water buffalo, and I don't know whether it was a deer got in by itself or whether it was put over the fence, but there were animals inside the wire and they were setting off mines. So every day my sergeant and I had to go back into the minefield that had been laid. We're laying it as a linear thing, walk back down the unmarked centre line, find these craters and replace an anti-lift device and a mine where one's been set off. However, the dogs and the buffalo and the deer didn't always get killed with the first mine they set off, because often they were running and they'd set off a tripwire instead of the actual pressure prongs. And it was fairly discombobulating to see a wounded dog running towards you, setting off mines behind them. So the number one on the mine arming party was armed with an M79 grenade launcher, an M16 and a shotgun loaded with canister, right? So he had 3 weapons to use, all 3 of them if necessary, to kill that dog, cat, buffalo, whatever was coming at him, because otherwise things might get pretty nasty. Anyway, I had to go in and with the sergeant. We had a staff sergeant and a sergeant in the troop. So there was a captain, a second lieutenant or lieutenant, staff sergeant, and then a small headquarters and 4 really large sections, 15 men or so.
Yeah.
And anyway, the sergeant and I were the rearming party. So we go back down each day and reset anyone's that had been gone off in the night. On this particular day, the 9th of May, we were just progressing through the arming party, which there's people digging holes, there's people laying out mines but not arming them, and then the arming party, which is a fairly drill-precise kind of procedure to do it safely, arm their mines, step back to the centre line, move on to the next one and so on. And so we've just passed through the arming party, and Sapper John, known as Jethro Thompson, and the staff sergeant, George Biddlecombe, are having a bit of an altercation because Jethro thinks it's time for their mob to have a break. He's a plant operator. Now, as I said earlier, when we were doing the protective minefield, we were using just field engineers, bit more experienced in doing that sort of thing. By the time we got on to trying to meet this 1,000 mines a day thing, we're using everyone, painters and chippies and plumbers and cooks even, anyone that we had in the troop, and plant operators and truck drivers as well.
Yeah.
And Jethro was not happy. He was only happy moving dirt. That was his job. All I do. And anyway, he was having a whinge about, and he and I have discussed this on numerous occasions. We have slightly different opinions as to what happened on that day, but that's okay. I stayed conscious all day. He didn't. And anyway, and we've had this discussion. It's nothing I'm saying, he would find offensive. He won't agree with it, but he won't find it offensive because he knows. And I launched his book when he wrote his book, and I mentioned all this sort of stuff then. And so it's not like it's a secret. But anyway, Jethro was giving a bit of lip, and probably justified, I don't know. But he wasn't paying attention. And they just had a short break, a quick sip of water and get back into it, and he stepped on the last mine he laid.
Yeah, right.
And
so he was one of the arming party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Subsequently, 2 died, not at the scene, but we finished up with 7 guys on the ground.
Yeah, right.
And I was 19 paces. Brett Nolan, the sergeant, and I were 19 paces through the arming party when it went off. Now, I know that because I had a haversack full of mines and Brett Nolan had a haversack full of grenades and fuses. And as soon as the thing went off, bang, we thought it could be an incoming round. We didn't know what it was. Yeah, mine just does it, a million things in a nanosecond. And setting off a mine wasn't part of the original consideration until I looked back and saw all these bodies on the ground. Like, what have we done? And so we dumped our packs on the centre line and ran back along the centre line to render assistance. Anyway, the screams for dust-off helicopters and, all sorts of things. And Brett and I were working on Jethro. There were other guys working on the other casualties. And he was a mess. And, I remember thinking, he's not going to live. But you don't say that. I knew enough not to express, and hopefully my face didn't say it either, but, maybe I did. I don't know. But you're careful what you say in that situation. You sound positive. You're going to make it, mate. Funny thing about explosive injuries is that they don't bleed quite as much as you would expect. You take a whole limb off, you expect femoral artery to be gushing like crazy. Yeah. But the explosion itself partially cauterises the wound. Not fully, but partially. And so there was blood, but it wasn't, surging femoral artery kind of stuff that you see in the movies. Yeah. But he was badly injured. His hands were badly injured. He had a flak jacket on. The arming party wore flak jackets and a helmet. What good that was going to do, I don't know, but it did it protected his body to a certain extent, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to get that off him. And the other guy, Jethro, had all the pins from the mines they just laid. And they're all scattered around amongst a cluster. Only one mine's gone off. And there's other mines. And where's the pins to disarm these bloody mines? Oh, yeah. And Jethro's got them in his pockets. It was just his job, Unfortunately, he's the one now whose pockets and trousers and everything else have been scattered at the four winds and pins are everywhere. We all run around, not running around, but people are madly trying to find pins, nails, or anything to put into these mines to just make them safe for the time being. Right. Wouldn't do anything for the anti-lift, but at least, it wasn't going to set the mines off. Anyway, it was... I lost track of time. I don't know how long it took. We finished up with 2 dust-off choppers. I mentioned earlier that we had infantry on the outside of the fence, the other side of the fence, and they called up a dust-off and we called up a dust-off, and they eventually dispatched 2, which was okay because we had 5 casualties.
What's a dust-off?
That's the I beg your pardon. It's the Kazakh helicopter.
Okay.
And they're often, in those days, they're American. They're often flown by conscientious objectors. Right, they won't shoot, they won't kill people, but they're trained as pilots or first aid, corpsmen in the Navy, aidmen in the Army. And so I don't know whether these guys were anyway, initially one was a American dust-off and one was Australian chopper. We know the name of the pilot and everything else. Can't remember it, but we've got that down in his book. Anyway, the aircraft arrived and they were loaded on. Jethro was one of the last to be put on, right? So they loaded up the lists, cleared the guys out of the way. When Jethro was loaded on, he'd lost so much blood and so much fluids at this stage, and they were pumping plasma or saline or whatever they had into him like crazy. But it didn't, they'd run out. And so they actually, on the way back, they stopped at a South Korean base, naval base, I believe, en route to the hospital to stock up on more fluids for him. Yeah, right. And anyway, at this stage, this is the 9th of May, 1967, and I'm due to leave in a fortnight. I'm finished my 12 months. And so I didn't get to see Jethro. I went and visited the 2 guys that were in Long Bin, one of whom died and one who survived. Another one died. So we lost 2 men dead and the rest were injured. But we also had a lot of blokes who were pretty badly affected mentally as a result of it. I mean, this is not a thing you just sort of say, let's get on with it. Probably the hardest thing I did that day, and I know Graham and I discussed it. He was the captain. He and I talked about it later. Our hardest job was getting the guys back to work because we had to just cover up the blood and goo and keep laying. And, getting those guys to do that, I'm not saying they resisted it, but they were obviously affected by this incident.
Yeah, for sure.
And getting them to get back to doing exactly the same job as had been being done at around 9 o'clock in the morning when the incident occurred. I don't remember the exact time, but it was early mid-morning, 9 o'clock-ish, and to get them to get back, because we had our whole days laying it to do.
Yeah.
And we had a deadline, 1,000 mines a day. We only ever achieved 1,000 mines later when we allocated infantry to dig the holes.
Oh, yeah.
Because that took, quite a bit of time, and anyone can dig a hole. And so they were given a pattern to lay out on the ground, and the centre line was marked in tape, and they were shown what to do. Or I don't mean shown how to use shovel, but where the holes needed to go.
Yeah.
And probably someone to supervise it. And that we eventually got to the 1,000 mines a day, but initially we weren't within a bull's roar of it.
So dragging heels after the event?
Well, look, I'm so proud of those guys. They did it, but God knows how. I was having enough trouble keeping my bloody shit in one sock, but, trying to motivate, NCOs to get onto the blokes, to get onto the job was probably the hardest thing I ever had to do in my military career. I can't think of anything else that comes more that close to it. In terms of working with soldiers, I had later time with the UN where I was in some pretty harrowing situations, but, that was just me by myself or me with other officers rather than blokes I was trying to direct their activities. But, they did it. And, it's a credit to one troop and one field squadron that they, just pulled their socks up and went back to it. And I'm so proud of them. And they... I don't remember all of them individually by name, but by God, I tell you what, when we get together, you can imagine the stories at reunions and things like that.
How often do you have reunions?
Look, they're infrequent, but, one of the things that we did with Mates for Mates was we were to have 5 of us from one troop on Tenacious when they had that tall ship out from Britain, and Mates chartered 30-something places on Tenacious. Jethro unfortunately experienced some vertigo in the week leading up to it and wasn't allowed to go on board. But Jethro, myself, Maxie Staggard, Kevin Smith and Tony Evans. So there were going to be 5 of us from that time together, and that would have been great. Unfortunately, Jethro had to pull out the last minute, which was a shame. But so, and I have a photo we took on the ship of the 3 of them, Max, Kevin and Tony, carrying me. I'm lying sideways and they're holding me horizontally, and the caption for the photo was always going to be, carrying the officers as we always did.
Cute. Do you still see Jethro these days?
Oh, yeah, I was talking to him yesterday, actually. I talked to him. I see him frequently. He's just had a time in hospital, but God knows, he's... and I always try and contact him on the 9th of May.
Okay.
We call it Boom Boom Day. And I don't say Happy Boom Boom Day. I think that's probably going a bit far. But I just tell him I'm thinking about him on Boom Boom Day, and he gets back to me and says, it's not something we celebrate, but it's, the fact that he survived. When I saw him under that chopper, I didn't see him again for 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't expect him to live.
Yeah.
I really was he survived.
You found out within that time period, or you didn't find out?
No, I think I may have heard that he'd survived, but he was in Melbourne. I wasn't in Melbourne at any stage in that period. In 1987-ish, one of the channels, 7 or 9, did a mini-series called The Sword of Honour, and it was about the top graduate from Duntroon going off to Vietnam, and the Sword of Honour is the prize that the top graduate gets.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why they call the series that. And he went off and it was a Vietnam War story, but based around this particular character. Anyway, for the grand launch of the movie or the 2 mini-series, they wanted to use the Victoria Barracks officers' mess and I was the social member of the Officer of Mess Committee at the time, and the negotiations were done with me. And they wanted as many officers to turn up to this thing, and they were going to bring in all their, funding people and, all the things that the TV channel would want to be there. But they wanted us all to wear a different uniform if we could, to show all, so summer mess dress, winter mess dress, khakis, greens, all the whole 9 yards anyway. So we're all dressed in different uniforms. It looked like a bag of, really bad dress-up party. And anyway, I was on the greeting line as people came in because I was, on the committee and all that sort of thing. Anyway, this taxi pulled up out the front of the mess, and a woman got out of the far side and she walked around to the near side and opened the door, and out gets this bloke on crutches. And I'm looking at him, and I didn't recognise him by face, but I looked at all the bits missing. I thought, there can't be two people in the world missing the bits that I remember Jethro losing. That's got to be Jethro Thompson. Anyway, I got a name badge on, just my family name. The uniform had your family name on it. Nameplate, yeah. And he walked up and he got a big shit-eating grin on his face. He said, "G'day, Joe." Jethro, what the hell? And Pearl, who was his wife, looked at him because she didn't know him as Jethro. He was Jethro in the army and still is Jethro to me. He's John to her, and the family all talk about him as John. And anyway, so after that, they'd moved from Victoria up to Ormo or something like that, and so they were living closer. And at that stage, I think he was one of the poobahs of the limbless soldiers. That's why he was attending this particular function. And but he was, we didn't immediately become best buddies and see each other every week, but I think we met several times, mostly through sapper get-togethers every 3 months or so, which we, not tied to the unit or anything, just any sapper. We gathered at different RSLs in those days. Now we just gather at RSL at Gaythorne.
Yep.
Every 3 months. It's very informal. Just turn up if you can and catch up with people and do the did he die, did he? Routine. It happens at all these. Did he die? Did he? I didn't know he died.
Oh, God. That's cute and dark.
Yes.
Mate, I feel like we could go for another 3 hours, but
I'm happy.
We definitely have to do another pod, I think, because how many more years did you serve after that?
Oh, I did 25 altogether.
Yeah, so that was only your
that was the first couple of years. Yeah. That was 1967. I joined in 63. So 63 at Duntroon, 64 at Portsea, most of 65 training at the School of Military Engineering, leading up to going to Vietnam in 66, coming out of there May of 67, and in a construction squadron in Sydney for 6 months, and then 2 years in New Guinea.
What if we looked at the Vietnam thing, would you say that was the most memorable?
Not always
event?
Necessary for the good things, but it certainly probably had the biggest impact on my life of anything. And I say that knowing that I've got married and had kids and all those other experiences in my life, but I think it probably is the most influential year of my life. And not to say that other events don't loom large in my life and my evaluation of my life, but in fact, as I said, I went up there as, I was still barely turned 20, and you grow up an awful lot, doing that sort of stuff. Yeah. You don't come back from that sort of thing and go back to being what you were before. And of course, I was in denial for the next 50 years that I had any problems, but and it took a bout with cancer to sort of shake me out of my reverie and realise that I wasn't as bulletproof as I thought I was at 20.
Oh, really? When did that happen?
60. When I was 68, which is 2014.
Okay.
And
what cancer?
Prostate.
Attempted to
prostate,
take
and it was picked up early enough to just be knocked over without any chemo or radio afterwards.
Okay.
Constant checkups and things like that. And I'm a big advocate for guys, irrespective of age, getting PSA tests done, because your age is your percentage chance of having prostate cancer.
Oh,
right? Yeah.
What's a PSA stand for?
I can't remember exactly. It's a blood test, and they check your prostate, something or other.
Okay.
A simple blood test, totally painless, just like any other thing. Check your triglycerides and your sugars and your all the other stuff. Just go to your doctor and get checked regularly, because
What age do you reckon that starts becoming important?
Well, we were being checked while I was in the army.
Oh, I
got out at 42, so in my 30s I was being tested for it within the military. Then I got out and I let it lapse for a while. And then I started meeting up with a few blokes who had prostate cancer, and it's a bad thing to go with. And so suddenly the bell rang, and I thought, I better do. And I've been getting tested for years and years and years and years, and it was that regime of being tested that they picked up the slight increase in PSA level, which wasn't dramatic, but it was just incrementing every time I did it, every 3 or 6 months that I got the blood test done. It was just a tiny decimal point higher.
Yeah.
And I had a crusty old doctor in Stafford who said to me, look, it may be nothing, but do me a favour, go and see this urologist and get it checked out just in case. Got it checked out, and sure enough, guess what, mate? You got cancer. No, there must be a surprise. Enlarged prostate, maybe, but not cancer, surely. You got cancer. You're not the doctor I am. And,
3 words that nobody wants to hear.
Yeah. But honestly, by getting it identified early, it was the best cancer to get. I mean, nobody likes any time in hospital. But I'd got to age of 68 without spending a night in hospital other than when I was born.
What?
I never spent a night in hospital until I went in to get prostate removed.
Wow.
Which is not a bad average considering the life I've led.
Yeah.
I've been in tons of emergency wards over the years for all sorts of, bits broken off here and cuts there and God knows what. But never spent a night in hospital. And all of a sudden I had to do 2 nights. 2 nights. It broke a bloody good record.
Jeez. So what happened after NAM?
Well, as I said, 6 months in a construction squadron, basically getting people ready to go to Vietnam, I guess we were doing. We were doing some building, worked on Long Bay Rifle Range and, a bunch of other jobs around in the Sydney area, and then got a posting in New Guinea for 2 years with what was one of our longer deployments. We had a unit up there from 1963 to 1996, and I did 1968-69 in Popondetta with this unit, basically doing public works department type stuff. We were part of the public works department of the administration of Papua New Guinea before it became an independent country.
Okay.
And, building roads and bridges and airfields and maintaining them, and schools and hospitals and all sorts. Anything the public works department was responsible for, we did for that particular district, now called a province.
Well received.
Oh, yeah, it was good, very interesting work. And then after that, back to Brisbane, a few years in Brisbane, different units.
Did you have, sorry to interrupt, did you have, I know a lot of people talk about the return of Vietnam having, society's discouragement.
Yeah, exactly.
To put it lightly.
When I got back to Liverpool after I came home, went back to work, I thought, I'm a returned serviceman. I better go and join the RSL. So I fronted up in an RSL in Liverpool and basically got told, stuff off, hairy legs. You haven't been to a real war.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I thought, well, stick your bloody RSL up your butt. I'm getting out of here. When I went to New Guinea, it was different. A lot of the area that we were in had a lot of soldiers' settlement plantations, either cocoa, copra, something else. I can't remember coconut, coffee. Yeah, coffee was the other one. And these guys were soldiers, Army, Navy, Air Force, the ex-service person given a grant to set up a farm, basically. And so we had a lot of these.
They lived over there?
Yeah, essentially, World War II vets in the main, and maybe a few earlier than that. And so there was a fairly robust collection of rambunctious types. I mean, they certainly weren't polite society. Anyway, our Anzac Day ceremony was the unit, District Engineer's Office, we were called at that stage, had other names at different times, and we'd march in uniform with our gongs and whatever, and they'd march with their little banner not a banner so much as just a simple label thing on a stick, 2nd 35th Battalion or, 2nd 8th Artillery or whatever it happened to be. And there were only 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 in some cases. Now, my administrative person in the unit was a German-born lady of mature age called Annalise, and her husband had been a colonel in the desert fighting Australians, amongst others, and he was killed in the desert, in the Western Desert, and Annalise was duly advised that her husband is no more. His batman after the war, his batman at the time, when after the war, came back to this same town that Annalise lived in, and they teamed up and they got married. And he was now working with the Australian government in PNG in Papua New Guinea. Oh, yeah. So he used to march behind us with a little banner saying Deutsche Afrika Korps, the Panzers. Yeah, he was representing the Panzers, and he was a one person, and nobody gave us stuff. We all thought it was bit more funny than serious. Yeah, in Australia that wouldn't have happened in those days. This is the late 60s. If some Japanese guy had turned up at the back of the parade with a little banner saying he fought for Japan, he'd have been stoned to death. I don't think the Germans and Italians would have been, and they probably weren't interested in doing it then. I mean, it just wasn't the culture. But for this guy, he had to be part of it, and he was, and turned up afterwards, and we all drank ourselves stupid like everyone else does on Anzac Day.
And how'd you go with your recovering from your time over in Vietnam?
I didn't have a problem as far as I was concerned. Admittedly, about I think it was the second or third weekend home, I was living in Holsworth in Anzac Village, and an Army Reserve unit started firing machine guns on the Holsworthy Range, which is adjacent to the married quarters. Now, some distance away, but still within hearing distance. And I was having a sleep in and hear this machine gun fire. So I'm out of bed and under the bed and breaststroking through the bloody floor, trying to anyway. And my wife's looking at me saying, "What the hell's going on? What are you doing?" And I wake up and I realise I'm being very, very silly. But, my brain had said, machine gun fire, get in your hole. and I was trying to find a hole to get in. But I wasn't conscious of the fact that I had problems.
There were some body reactions, but not mental.
Yeah. Well, I look back on it now and I know there were mental problems. I was just in denial. At that stage, PTS didn't even get recognised. It didn't even have that name.
Shell shock,
whatever. And there were a few people who'd figured out how to work the DVA system and get in it, and they were doing damn well. But the rest of us looked down our nose at them as if to say, you bloody tosser, you're bludging on the system, nothing wrong. You got no wounds, no visible wounds. What are you on about? That's a very different attitude to today, but that was society then. That was a hangover from previous wars, and nobody really identified it as such,
Even in the early 2000s, it was like that.
Yeah.
It's only sort of just changing now.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I had this bout with cancer and I'd barely been going to the doctors. I've been getting these blood tests and things like that, but I hardly ever had a need to go to a doctor. And anyway, I turned up after I'd got out of hospital and recuperated fully from the cancer and everything. I was doing pretty well. But my mental process was this. I didn't have any symptoms. It was picked up by, testing and things like that. But I had no pain. I had no, I probably had a bit of trouble peeing and got up 2 or 3 times a night to have a leak and said to everyone else, what the hell? Enlarged prostate maybe, but not cancer. And I went to the opposite extreme after I'd recovered, and I thought, hang on, I just coughed 3 times. Maybe I should go and get the doctor to check that out. I got a bit of a twinge in my back. Oh, that's not good. I better go and get that. Anyway, my GP started to look at me a bit strange because I was becoming a bit more regular than I'd ever been before in coming for appointments. And he said, "Have you ever seen a shrink?" I said, "No, what do I want to do that for?" He said, "Why don't you go and see a shrink?" He took my advice about going to see the urologist. Go and see a shrink. So anyway, I contacted RSL and said, how does that guy get a shrink? And they sent me to a DVA psychiatrist.
Oh, yeah.
He interviewed me for 20 minutes. He wrote a report, a 1-page report after 20 minutes, the bottom line of which said there is nothing wrong with this man other than that he went to Vietnam. Now, you can read that any way you like, but I don't think that was a very professional assessment. And I took that back to the GP and he looked at it and he said, that's a crock of shit. He said, let's give you a second referral, a second opinion. Referred me to the psychiatrist I see now, and she reckoned the minute I walked in the door, she diagnosed me. I don't know why. I don't believe her necessarily. I mean, I don't know why she would have said that, but I've been seeing her now ever since. I see her every 3 months or so.
What's that, like 10 years or something?
Oh, it would be 10 years now, yeah. And, I saw her a lot more frequent the early days, but it's gradually spaced it out. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, whatever. The thing is that her argument is, it's not that you need to do this, but I can pick up on changes that you may go back to if I see you, reasonably regularly. And we just had that experience in Bondi with that guy who was, sent off by his shrink as showing those symptoms and with no follow-up and no need to come back for any further assessment, and he went bonkers. So, I can see where she's coming from. Her view is it's not that you need it, it's just that I can assess you by – we sit and chat about anything and everything. It's not a case of lying on the couch or anything like that anymore.
Yeah.
Just sit there and have a gas bag, and we'll probably spend more time talking about Trump and his bloody idiocies than we will spend about, how's Joe feeling today and how does that make you feel and all the other platitudes that you see in the movies. We just gas bag, and she makes an assessment based on that, he's thinking logically or he's thinking erratically or he's not keeping up with current events and other assessments I presume she's making. And
better to have and not need than need and not have.
It cost me nothing. DVA pick up the tab. I'm not being flippant about that, but hey, if it means, I think my quality of life has been a whole lot better since I've been diagnosed and treated.
Yeah, nice.
And there's a fantastic program at the Toowong Private Hospital that she put me into, which is a 6-week program.
Keith Payne, what is it?
No, this is at Toowong Private Hospital, which is separate from Keith Payne. I think is a part of Greenslopes, isn't it?
Oh, Greenslopes, yeah, correct. Yeah.
And this is a private hospital on Mogul Road or one of those roads.
Okay.
I've driven past it countless times. Didn't even realise it was a hospital, to be honest. But she got me onto that program, and it was and it wasn't just Vietnam vets. So there was one other guy who was a Vietnam vet. Others were from more recent conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq, New Guinea, which really surprised me. A young lass that was an EW operator put into a submarine and set off to do things, and she suffers from massive claustrophobia as a result of it. No selection, no assessment or anything, just put on a sub. I'm not sure how I'd handle it, let alone her. But, there was all sorts of different people with different experience, Air Force as well as Navy and Army. It wasn't I assumed that I put my hand up to do it, that it would just be Vietnam vets. They don't put emergency service workers and non-service people together. They run programs for those people.
Yeah.
They keep them separate because the problems are different.
Yeah.
I mean, the end result's the same, but the way to manage it is different, and the experience. Some of them have far more harrowing experiences than
emergency services.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
and just day to day as well.
When I hear some of the stories I hear, I think, my God, what I went through is bugger all compared to that.
Yeah.
And they're facing it day after day.
They don't get enough recognition for what they go through.
Of course they don't. And Ambo's getting bashed by bloody drunken bums that, can't recognise that I'm here to help you. And you think, why would you go back and do another day worth?
Yeah.
I'll take my hat off to them.
Children
male and
gone through
female.
stuff.
Yeah, I mean, those guys who had to attend that fire in Toowoomba last week, where the kids died, injured. Just think, go home to your own kids and how do you interact with them when you've just had that experience? And you can't unthink that stuff. Once it's there, it's imprinted in your brain.
I'd last one call out, I reckon, before I threw that towel in. Yeah. It's a bit of how do you feel about today's army?
Oh, look, I know nothing about today's army. I mean, it is so different. I recently, this year is the 100th anniversary of the Corps of Signals, and I was asked to speak, because they came from engineers, I was asked to speak at the 100th anniversary dinner that the association ran here in Geebung. And I did my talk. I liaised with the CO of 1 SIG regiment who was going to talk about the modern battlefield, and I was talking about the past, and so we weren't going to cross over at all. And when she got up and spoke about the modern battlefield, I was scared shitless, and I'll never be there.
Yeah.
I mean, the business about, and how quickly you can pick up a headquarters or a gun battery or a firing position or something like that compared to what it used to be in the past. And if you stay stationary for 10 minutes, you're a target and you're going to get obliterated. No!
It's fire and move.
Yeah, damn right. and don't stay in any one place.
Mate, I wouldn't,
I couldn't survive. I mean,
looking at the
training,
Ukraine.
But see, I don't have the nowadays it's all tech. They need geeks in the army now, not big bronzed Anzacs. I mean, they need them too, but by and large...
the next army's going to be bloody...
The hard decisions are made by
nerds.
Play
PlayStation really well. I remember I was at the Soldier Recovery Centre a couple of years ago, and they did some kids come through with like drone pilot, like races. So they set up like these little rings, and they're smashing these drones around with VR goggles on. And they're just like kids just like having fun and competing and stuff. I'm like, what they don't realise is they're grooming these kids for the next war.
The technology, and just going back to the prostate, the surgeon that did the work looked like he was 13 or 14. He wasn't, but when I first met him, I thought, Christ, I hope he's only the assistant. And it was done with a robot, and he was 4 or 5 metres away from me on the table, doing it all with a robot. He was, and I said, how'd you learn to do that kind of stuff? And he said, I was heavily into PlayStation when I was a kid. And I thought, that'd be right.
Well, that'd scare the shit out of me.
Well, no, but
Get
the
over
thing
here
was,
and do it yourself.
Yeah, but the thing was that, the recovery time is so much quicker because they're tiny little incisions rather than a big, used to be a cut from basically your buddy pubis up to your chest sort of thing, and they'd go in there and start running around trying to find the bits that don't work and pull them out. And now... I couldn't even show you a scar from any of the incisions that they made. They're so tiny. Nice. And it's just miraculous. And that's 10 years ago, so probably improved on it endlessly since then.
Yeah, probably.
These things move very, very quickly.
Cool. Well, I'll let you get out of here. That's, anything else you want to add?
No, I've enjoyed exchanging. Give me an audience, I'll talk.
For sure. I'm sure you've got plenty more stories, but we'll maybe pick up a number 2 at some stage.
Any time if you want to have a chat, I'm happy.
Awesome, mate. Thanks for being here. Thanks for telling your stories. And
thank you for giving the time as well.
Beautiful. Cheers.